Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Elmer took a drag on his Marlboro, paused a moment to consider the playing cards pinched between his thumb and forefinger, then blew the smoke from his nostrils in two thick plumes. He surveyed the two men before him, then let his gaze wander aimlessly over the parking lot of the Triple B. The Triple B truck stop was an oasis of light along the darkest stretch of Highway 19. The highway spans from the Florida Panhandle, across the coast of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, before finally terminating a hair's breadth from the Mexico border in Texas. There were a lot of empty spaces between the cities and towns along the way, and the Triple B filled one of those gaps. Half gas station and half diner, it offered a refuge to the weary truckers who made their living hauling cargo from one end of the South to the other. After getting the trucks lined up and settled for the night, Elmer had suggested a sort of friendly game of poker. His young trainee Kyle had wrestled the little card table out of the truck, and there they sat, betting quarters and dimes beneath the tall parking lot lights. He'd coordinated the stop with his buddy Lewis, hoping that before the night was over, he'd have a pocketful of the old man's cash. "God damn it, Elmer," Lewis said, his words puffing out the hairs of his thick gray and handlebar mustache. "Would you quit being dramatic and decide what the hell you're going to do with those cards before I up and die over here?" Elmer retrieved a cigarette from his lips and cocked an eyebrow towards Lewis. "Why, Lewis, are you down and didn't even tell me?" "Every day," Lewis growled. "But I'd like to finish this damn hand before the Reaper's blade tears me a new asshole." "Language, Lewis," Elmer chided. "Little pitchers have big ears." "I'm 23, Kyle said, his voice flat. "Why do you two insist on treating me like a child?" Elmer chuckled. "Ain't no offense intended, kid. I'm just old enough to be your father, you know. Hitting the big 5-0 in a few years. Lewis here could be your grandfather." "Fuck off, Elmer," Lewis grumbled. "I ain't that much older than you." "Point being," Elmer continued, "we were just trying to connect with the typical example of the American youth of today through sarcasm and well-meaning insults about your mother and what she may or may not do in the bedroom." "And there ain't much she won't do in the bedroom," Lewis concluded. Lewis and Elmer's laughter echoed across the nearly empty parking lot. All right, Kyle said. "Say what you want about my mama, but it ain't gonna stop me from taking all your money tonight." Lewis smiled, his mustache curling with the corners of his mouth. "Sounds to me like the apple don't fall too far from the whore tree." "Goddamn, I walked right into that one," Kyle said. His eyes widened as he pointed a finger at Lewis, whose smile suggested he had another quip. "Don't do it, old man." "I wouldn't gonna," Lewis said. "Low-hanging fruit. Now, if you had said you backed up into that one." That drew more laughs until Elmer waved his hand. "Okay, boys, enough chit-chat. Time to pay up." Elmer slapped his hand down on the flimsy table. "Straight." "Shit," Lewis said, tossing his cards face down on the table. Kyle grinned and Elmer's smile faltered. "Flush," Kyle said, and slowly fanned his cards out to show a row of clubs. Elmer grimaced. "That money would have been better spent on your mama." Lewis and Kyle laughed again, but Elmer only managed to smile. He'd never tell the kid, but he enjoyed hanging around with him. It made him feel younger, or nostalgic at the thought of being 23 again, maybe. What was he doing at Kyle's age? Probably high off his ass and bumming around from couch to couch in a Soundgarden t-shirt. No one heard the woman's footsteps over the laughter.
Hello?
She said. Their laughs tapered off. They all looked at her as she stumbled over to them. She looked to be about Kyle's age. Her dark hair had an orange shine to it from the sodium lights overhead, and it flowed down over her shoulders to the straps of her navy shirt, the logo for NASA printed across the front. It didn't fit quite right, too short and riding up enough to show the skin just above the top of her jeans. And it didn't take more than a glance to tell she wasn't wearing a bra, even if you weren't trying to look. "We ain't interested," Lewis said, dismissively waving his hand. "Hop on over to another truck, lizard," she said.
Please, I need help.
She fell forward, knocking the small table over and sending the cards flying and tumbling like dead leaves.
Jesus!
Kyle yelled, stepping over the mess and reaching out to her. He rolled her over and rested her head on one of his thighs.
Are you okay?
She mumbled something too low for Elmer to hear.
Tell her to speak up,
Lewis said. Elmer gave him an irritated sideways glance, then knelt beside the woman. "Hey, we're going to get you some help, okay? What's your name?"
Lindsay.
She said, her voice a little clearer this time.
Lindsay Jackson. I'm not sure what's going on.
We'll help you figure it out,
Kyle said.
You got family nearby?
Are we still in the park?
The three men looked at one another, confused.
"What park?"
Lewis asked.
Oak Mountain,
she said.
"Never heard of it,"
Lewis snorted.
"You on drugs or something?"
"Give her a break, man," Elmer said. He dug his cell phone from his pocket, opened the browser, and searched for Oak Mountain. His eyes widened in the blue-white glow of the phone's screen. Elmer cleared his throat. Kyle, you stay with her. Lewis, let me talk to you for a minute." Elmer led Lewis around the truck and stopped in front of the grill. "Lewis, Oak Mountain State Park is in Alabama, and it's damn near 600 miles from here." Lewis raised one gray eyebrow.
"Pardon?"
Elmer turned the phone around to show him. "That ain't all, Lou. I wish to Christ it was, though, because my head's about to bust open." Elmer scrolled further down the page and clicked on the link.
"Search continues for girl missing in Oak Mountain State Park,"
Lewis read aloud, squinting at the screen. Look at the date," Elmer said. "She went missing in August. It's November now."
"I know what damn month it is, boy,"
Lewis said. Elmer pushed the phone closer to Lewis's face.
"The picture, Lou. Look at the damn picture." "All right. Jesus. You know I ain't got my reading glasses on. Just let me see it,"
he said, taking the phone from Elmer's shaky fingers and holding it out at arm's length to see it clearly.
"Picture of Lindsay Jackson taken on the day she went missing,"
he mumbled.
"So what? Oh, Jesus."
He slowly gave the phone back to Elmer.
"What does it mean?"
"I ain't got a fucking clue," Elmer said, looking at the picture again. It showed Lindsay, same dark hair, wearing the same NASA shirt and jeans, and a pink backpack hanging from her shoulders. "But this girl in the picture can't be more than 12 years old, Lou. The woman over there looks about as old as Kyle."
"It ain't possible,"
Lewis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it," Elmer said, "but it's still happening anyway. Lindsay Jackson, not even a teenager, went missing 600 miles from here. And now she shows up 3 months later, still wearing the same clothes, now too damn small for her, 'cause she's a goddamn decade older."
"Jesus Christ,"
Lewis said, and shook his head.
"I wish you hadn't just spelled it out like that. That just made it all worse."
"Well, let's get back to Kyle," Elmer said. They returned to the scattered mess of the card game. Lindsay was now sitting up, her head down, dark hair hanging over her face. "You do it any better, miss?" Elmer said. She looked up with haunted eyes.
I'm starting to remember things I don't understand.
Well, Well, that's good, ain't it?
Lewis said.
That you're remembering, not that you can't understand it.
He turned to Elmer and mumbled,
I don't even know what the hell I'm saying here.
Kyle awkwardly patted her shoulder.
Can you tell them what you told me?
She nodded and began.
I was with my family at the state park. We were having fun, fishing and swimming and everything. We had a campfire one night, and I had to, go. But I didn't want to walk all the way to the public restrooms. So my dad said, just walk a little way into the trees.
She grimaced.
But when I was done, I couldn't find my way back. Everything was dark and the trees were closed in, and I screamed for my dad, but no one answered. I walked in the direction that I'd come from. I don't know how long, and then I saw the lights.
I knowed it. Goddamn aliens.
Elmer gave him a disapproving look, but said nothing. After all, he didn't have a better explanation.
What?
She said.
No, nothing like that. They were headlights.
In the woods? Elmer said. Did you come up on a road or something? She shook her head.
Not that I remember. I just saw them shining through the trees and I walked to them. It was...
Her face grew animated and her eyes wide.
It was like this. A truck like this.
She stabbed a finger at Elmer's Peterbilt. Wait, you found one of these in the woods? Elmer said.
It could be a logging truck,
Kyle said.
I ain't never been up that way, but maybe.
Lindsay,
Lewis said.
Did it have a flatbed with big logs on the back?
No,
she said.
It was a big box like this one.
Well, shit,
Lewis said. Let's get her inside, Elmer said. Then we can call the authorities and try to figure this out. Ray's probably got the grill closed and clean, but I'm sure we can find you something to eat if you're hungry. Lindsay nodded and let Kyle help her up, but she kept one arm firmly covering her chest. Elmer pulled off his flannel shirt and held it out by the shoulders. Here, take this. She stuck one arm in and then the other and shrugged the shirt on as they walked past the gas pumps and over to the main building. The bell over the door rang out as Lewis opened the door, holding it wide for everyone to pass through. The lights overhead illuminated the rows of candies and chips. One of the old drink coolers in the back stood open, half empty, with boxes of cans waiting to be stocked inside. Cold air washed over Elmer's bare arms. Damn, you'd think Ray's cheap ass would have the AC turned down in November.
Yeah,
Lewis said.
And he still got all the diner's lights on, too. Must have had a late night.
Something tickled at the back of Elmer's neck. Something dark. Something wrong. Cal, he said as calmly as he could. Go behind the counter there and look beneath the register. Ray and Doreen always kept an old Mossberg pump action there. Grab it.
What?
Kyle said, a look of worry creeping over his features. Just do as I said, kid. What are we doing here, Elmer? Lewis said in a low voice. You think there's trouble? I don't know, Elmer said. But how many years we been coming to the Triple B? You ever know Ray to leave every light in the diner on past 9? Or leave the air running after sundown? Kyle spoke up from behind them.
I got it,
he said, and held the shotgun out to Elmer. Elmer shook his head. You hold on to it.
I don't even know how to use it.
Come on, son,
Lewis spat.
Your daddy ain't teach you nothing?
Kyle's face hardened.
My daddy died in Iraq when I was a baby. I don't know how to use this, and I don't want to neither.
All right, Elmer said with a solemn nod. I'll take it. Let's check the diner first. The diner was separate from the rest of the store, with its own set of double doors that led into a small dining area with a counter behind which Ray spent most of his days scrambling eggs, flipping burgers, and deep-frying corn dogs.
I don't want to go in there,
Lindsay said. Shit, neither do we, but we got to, Elmer said. He pressed the slide release on the shotgun and drew the forestock back, nodding at the shell visible in the chamber. He pushed the forestock forward once more, the clack too loud in the quiet of the room. Okay, let's move. Elmer held the shotgun ready, barrel pointed at an angle to the floor, the stock resting in the hollow of his shoulder. He pressed the thin metal door open and stepped into the diner. Blood dotted the yellowed linoleum floor in haphazard sprays, all leading to a puddle forming beneath the counter.
Sweet Jesus,
Lewis said in a breathless whisper. From behind him came the sounds of Kyle retching and spitting. Ray was laid out on the top of the counter, one arm dangling off the edge, blood dripping slowly from his fingertips. Steak knives stuck out from his torso like a porcupine's quills. Well, hey there, gentlemen. The man was sitting in the back booth, wearing a cowboy hat, a blood-streaked white shirt, and a wide grin. He had an arm around Doreen, her eyes red and swollen, her nearly white hair disheveled. There was a dish towel tied around her head, gagging her, and her tied hand sat limply atop the table. She let out a muffled cry at the sight of Elmer and the rest. Come on in, the smiling man said. There's plenty of room, but if you're hungry, well, I wouldn't trust the food here, you know. Looks mighty unsanitary from where I'm sitting. Elmer raised the shotgun. I don't know who the fuck you think you are, mister, but you'd better let that woman go right now. The man tilted his head to the side and put on a comical look of feigned puzzlement. Now, surely you ain't gonna blast a bunch of buckshot this way, are you, friend? You run an awful lot of risk hitting good old Doreen here. And I think she's been through quite enough already. Ain't that right, Doreen? She said nothing, just silently wept.
Why?
Lewis said.
Why'd you kill Ray?
Oh, come now, the man said. Even with eyes as old as yours, you can see this was nothing but a terrible accident. Poor old Ray slipped and fell on a knife. Then he did it again, and then 20 or so more times. Why, if it wasn't so awful, then it would have been hilarious. He's no Laurel, or Hardy for that matter, but he definitely could have been the fourth stooge.
What the hell is he on about?
Kyle whispered. Elmer slowly took a few steps toward the man, careful not to slip in the blood. Hand over Doreen, and this can all be between you and the cops. We just want to make sure she's safe, that's all. That is mighty kind of you, the man said. He leaned back against his seat and sighed, and Elmer saw a scar on the man's neck right below his ear, shaped like the number 3. The man continued. But I just can't give her over. I will, however, propose a trade. I give you sweet Doreen here, and you give me back my little lost sheep. What are you talking about? Lindsay, of course, the man said. Let her come back to me and all is forgiven, and we can move on our separate ways. The men all turned and looked to Lindsay.
I just want to go home. Just want to go home. Just want to go home,
she whispered, her eyes shut tight and her balled-up fists held to either side of her head. You're the one who took her, Elmer said, stunned. You kidnapped her. I found her, the man said, pointing the knife he held toward Elmer. But I guess if you want to be specific, the witch in the woods found her, and I came to pick her up and take her away. To where? I just told you, the man said. Away. She ain't going anywhere else with you. Look, the man said, I'm what you'd call a middleman. I take lost little girls from one place and transport them to another. wherever the client wishes. And if I'm not back on the road with little Miss Lindsay here, then my boss, well, let's just say he won't be none too pleased."
"That sounds like your problem," Elmer said.
No, the man said. "If my boss gets involved, it's everyone's problem."
Lewis stood next to Elmer. "He's connected, Elmer," Lewis said. "Illuminati, or the Deep State, or something else." "Knock it off with that shit," Elmer hissed. "There ain't no Deep State, no Q, and no reptile people. Get your head out of Fox News' ass. He's just a murdering asshole with a hostage." "But what about that damn time jump, Elmer? Huh? What about that?"
"Yes," the middleman said with glee. "What about that, Elmer?"
"Shut the fuck up before I paint that wall with whatever brains you got left," Elmer said.
"Maybe I'm an alien," the middleman said. "Or maybe I'm a hidden operative all jumped up on adrenochrome. What do you think there, Lou?"
Lewis lowered his head, looking ashamed. "Could be either," he said. "Jesus wept," Elmer said. "Enough of this shit. Let the woman go."
The man sighed. "I really thought we could just make this easy. But I guess not."
The middleman swung the knife up in a vicious arc and planted the blade in the soft skin right beneath Doreen's chin. She sat there, eyes wide and jaw bobbing up and down, looking like a fish left out of water. He pulled the knife away, and Doreen's blood sprayed over the old tabletop.
"Oh, buddy," the middleman said with a laugh. "I ain't had this much fun in years."
Elmer let his eyes leave the growing puddle of Doreen's blood. He aimed a shotgun at the man's chest and pulled the trigger. No deafening boom came, only an underwhelming click.
"I'm afraid it ain't that easy."
He lifted himself up and stood on top of the table. Elmer racked the shotgun, sending a shell turning through the air as another clicked into place. He pulled the trigger again and was again disappointed. The middleman shrugged his shoulders.
"You can try the other shells if you like, but I'm gonna have to go ahead and tell you now, they ain't gonna work any better. When you've been around as long as I have, you get a feeling about these things."
Elmer lowered the shotgun, and his mouth felt dry and sticky as he spoke. "Who are you?" he asked.
"Mostly a man," the middleman said, and hopped down from the table, his boot heels clicking loudly on the floor. "And a little of something else."
"I can't let you take her," Elmer said. "I don't know what you are, but you can't take her again."
"You can't stop me, Elmer," he said. "And you can't stop her either. Lindsay, my sweet girl, do you remember our rhyme?"
Please don't take me.
she said.
Don't make me kill.
"Far in the wood, you'll find a well," he said,
Don't.
"with water deep and blue.
Please.
Whoever drinks by moonlight clear."
Lindsay's expression grew placid, her eyes staring as if at something far away.
We'll live 1,000 years,
she said.
"Good girl,"
the middleman said.
"Now go wait by my truck. These gentlemen won't stop you, because if they try, they'll find out how very unpleasant I can be when I'm angry."
She walked between the men and out the door.
"Well, I'll be taking my leave now," the middleman said. "I've got to get Miss Lindsay down there for her nap, so she can finish her last little bit of growing up before I drop her off."
"Why?" Kyle said. "Why make her? Why make her grow up?"
The middleman looked at him, considering. "Oh, okay. I guess I'll tell you a little bit. A tiny little bit. See,
I get them right before puberty sets in. It makes it easier for them to forget their soon-to-be old life while they're napping the miles away. And the years. Then, when they're nice and ripe, I drop them off to the clients. Easy peasy. For what? Lewis asked. Not my concern, really, the man said. After all, I'm just the middleman. Just a regular old trucker like yourselves, taking stuff from point A to, well, to some other point. He tipped his hat to them. It's been fun, gentlemen, but for all of your respective sakes, I do hope we never cross paths again. He left, and all three men followed him out wordlessly, then watched as the middleman sauntered to his truck. It was a great beast of a truck, black and chrome, all midnight and moonlight. Why didn't we see it earlier? Kyle said. Elmer didn't look at the kid when he spoke, because he didn't want us to. They all watched, transfixed as the truck soundlessly drove past him, then out of the parking lot and out into the night. Now what, Elmer? Lewis said. We call the police and don't say a word about anything other than finding Ray and Doreen dead. Kyle shook his head. We gotta say something, right? We can't just let that asshole get away. We can, Elmer said. And we did. I've seen a lot of crazy shit during my time on the road, kid. Most of it I can chalk up to something scientific, even if I don't understand the science behind it. Unlike Lewis here, who just knows it's all some crazy alien bullshit. Fuck you, Elmer, Lewis grumbled. But this, Elmer continued, I can't explain this, and I ain't gonna try to explain it to the cops either. Sometimes you just gotta drive on, kid. Drink some coffee, crank some tunes, and just drive on. That sounds like grade A bullshit to me, Kyle said sulkily. Elmer nodded. Yeah, it does. But sometimes that's all you get, kid. Sometimes that's the only explanation you get.
Andrew Rivers traveled for business. Sometimes he took his own car, other times a rental. Rentals were a mixed bag for him, because he never knew ahead of time if he would get a decent car. This meant one he could sleep in. His SUV had enough room in the back to lay down comfortably when the seats were folded. It wasn't a bed and mattress, but it was surely cheaper than a room for the night, and he was anything if not frugal. With his business growing, Andrew was beginning to drive farther and farther to recruit more clients. Soon, he might have to start outsourcing, but he was a hands-on kind of guy and didn't know if he could trust anyone to do this side of the job. Plus, he liked to travel. His current venture was promising to be very lucrative, and although he was going to miss Thanksgiving, he felt it was worth it. Hours from home, he stood outside his car at a rest stop with a camera in his hands taking pictures. He'd never been this close to the Rocky Mountains before, and they were breathtaking, just like in postcards. Dusk was descending upon the world, giving the mountains a red glow. It might have been eerie, if it wasn't so beautiful. Further up the road, he pulled into his booked motel. He alternated the nights when he would slept in his car. He needed to look his best when meeting clientele and could only do so much without a shave and shower at least every other day. After getting comfy, he booted his laptop to check on the pictures he'd taken. They weren't all keepers, but most turned out okay. One puzzled him, though. He didn't remember taking it. It wasn't of the mountains at all. The photo was of the tree line below the parking lot he'd pulled into. There wasn't much light with the setting sun, and the image was fuzzy, but two clear silver dots stood out. They might have been the eyes of some animal, or just specks of dust in the air, but for some reason he found them unsettling, like they were something he was never supposed to see. Unable to get the image out of his mind, Andrew had difficulty falling asleep. The silver eyes followed him into his dreams, stalking him, showing up around every corner, in everyone's face. He woke in the morning, not the least bit refreshed, to find the words, "Find You," painted on his windshield in deep red, almost brown letters. Some kids playing a prank on him, noticing the out-of-state license plate, he figured. Upon closer study, the paint smelled wretched, and brought to mind horrific images of its true origin. Worse, it refused to come off. Andrew scrubbed and scraped, but it seemed baked on, as if it had been sitting in the sun all day. He ended up buying some glue dissolvent, and even that left some behind. The letters didn't take up much space, but they would be a distraction he didn't need while driving on unfamiliar roads. Still, he'd wasted enough time on it, as it was, and couldn't afford to linger any longer. Andrew continued on his journey, continued doing his job, and stopped to take pictures of the scenery. This time he was careful of what he captured, checking each snapshot after taking it, making sure nothing was watching him. When the time came for him to hunker down for the night, it took him a while to find a decent place. Each town was different, and he wasn't always able to find an abandoned building to park behind, or someplace off the beaten path where he wouldn't be disturbed. Finally, he found a quarry that didn't appear to be operational anymore. It was quiet. Perfect. Andrew had a few snacks to eat before climbing into the back to spread out some blankets. Due to the previous night's restless slumber, he fell asleep quickly. He was woken in the middle of the night by a noise he couldn't identify. It sounded like a large animal. A cow, maybe. He wasn't a livestock expert. Then he heard another sound, one he did recognize. Children's laughter. While ordinarily a joyous sound in the dead of night and the middle of nowhere, it was like something out of a horror movie. Accompanying them was the pitter-patter of feet running around his car. He wanted to get up and look outside, but truthfully, he was frightened. If it really was children, he had nothing to worry about, and he tried to convince himself such was the case. But the laughter was tainted by a wheezing sickness, a throaty rasp. It was deeply disturbing, and couldn't have belonged to a child. He didn't know how long he laid in his car listening to them. He hoped if he was quiet, they wouldn't know he was there and eventually go away. But things only got worse. The children became more brazen, knocking on his car, tapping on the glass. Occasionally the car would lurch as if someone had shoved it. Andrew eventually lifted his head to peek out the window, wanting to see what was going on, but saw only vague shadows dancing in the scattered moonlight. Suddenly the roof groaned under the weight of someone or something climbing onto it. A deep, guttural bellow rented the air before what sounded like a waterfall splashed all over the car. Horrible images of a beast vomiting on his car sprang unwanted to his mind. As the roof began to buckle, Andrew knew he could hold his tongue no longer. He shouted for them to get off his car, for them to go away and leave him alone. And it all stopped. It was now dead quiet. He risked taking another look outside and saw the silver eyes. The same eyes in the photo. The same eyes from his dreams. Then a child spoke. "Please let us in." It started as the voice of a little girl, but ended twisted and raspy. Soon more silver eyes joined the first, as did more bitter, raspy child voices. Play with us. We won't bite. Be our friend. Come outside. Soon he was surrounded and hailed non-stop. Andrew grabbed his phone to call for help, only to find no signal. He knew it was likely to happen among the mountains, and of course, it would fail him when he needed it the most. Covering his ears and closing his eyes, he wished it would all go away. This couldn't be happening. Maybe he was just dreaming. Then he woke up. His blankets and clothing were in a knotted mess, and he was sweating profusely even though it was cold outside, but he had made it through the night. It was just a nightmare. But would a nightmare leave child-sized handprints all over the windows and a roof dented under the weight of some unknown animal, which now appeared to be sleeping on his hood, blocking his windshield? Scanning the immediate area outside the vehicle, he ensured he was alone, other than the beast on his car, before opening the rear hatch and climbing out. The sun couldn't be seen over the trees, but dawn had arrived no more than an hour ago, he was sure. How long had the ordeal gone on last night? Had he fallen asleep from exhaustion? Making his way warily to the front of the car, Andrew found not an animal like he was expecting, but more paint splashed all over the windshield. And written in the paint, in small, scraggly letters, were the words, "Find you, follow you." Andrew was beside himself, horrified. It couldn't be the same kids who were messing with him. It was impossible. That motel was at least 200 miles back. But how could the messages be the same? Were these people following him? Was it a cult of some kind? And were they children, or was it some twisted game? Was this going to continue to haunt him during his travels? Would it follow him home? He decided to find a police station and report the incident. Like the last time, the paint refused to be removed. Even the glue dissolver barely put a dent in it. With the windshield obstructed, there was no way Andrew could drive the car. So he stayed there, spending hours scrubbing it off, using up all the glue dissolvent, and eventually getting enough of it off to be able to drive into the nearest town to find a car wash. But its superior clean didn't live up to its name. Andrew had to settle with the half-finished job. He'd already spent too much time on it and was way behind on schedule. At least a room had been booked for that night. When he had time, he'd have to alter some of his plans. There was no way he was sleeping in his car again on this trip. Unfortunately, luck was not on his side. Having gotten a late start on this leg of his journey and having to drive slower and more carefully due to his partially obstructed view, Andrew showed up to his motel late, and due to the high demand of Thanksgiving weekend, his room had been given away. While furious, he understood and accepted the reasons for this and set out to find other accommodations. He found none. He tried the next town and the next. As night fell, Andrew became worried, then desperate, then scared. Whatever was stalking him would find him again, he was sure. He did not want to spend another night in his car, yet options were wearing thin. Weary from the lack of sleep from the night before, his eyes grew heavy, and after nearly driving off the road one too many times, he knew he couldn't go on. He found a brightly lit strip mall parking lot in a small town to stay in for the night. It wasn't an ideal location for a proper rest, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Surely he wouldn't be attacked in the open for all to see. Feeling safe, he settled in and began to doze off. Then there came a rapping at the window. Andrew sat up to see a police officer standing outside his car, peering inside with a flashlight. Noticing the out-of-state plates on the car, the cop had been watching him. Andrew stepped outside and was told he couldn't stay there. Reminded of his earlier promise to tell the authorities about his ordeal, Andrew explained his situation: the missed hotel, the Night Stalkers, the paint on his car, of which there was still evidence. It was quite the story, and the officer was skeptical, suspecting Andrew of being either drunk or stoned. However, he granted Andrew what he felt was a small mercy by not bringing him into custody. He told Andrew that if he felt strongly about the incident in the morning, he could come to the police station and file a report, but he had to leave until then. Unless, that is, he wanted to go to the station right now, in handcuffs. So Andrew got back into his car and drove around to find another spot to sleep. Not wanting any trouble from the police, he settled for parking outside of town, just past the reach of the streetlights, behind what appeared to be an abandoned gas station. He'd never been more scared in his life, and he knew he wasn't going to get any sleep that night. But since fear and stress can be exhausting, and since he'd slept little after his encounter the previous night, he was out quickly. He was woken quickly, as well as by another rapping on the window. Assuming it was the officer again, Andrew sat up and looked out the window, but there was no flashlight this time. No policeman. Just a dozen or so pairs of silver eyes glinting despite the darkness. As he'd expected and feared, the creatures had returned. They hailed him again, pounding on his car, demanding to be let in or for him to come out. Their creepy, lilting voices trailed off in hacking, acidic warbles that felt like daggers in his ears. They said he couldn't hide from them forever. They said they'd find a way inside. They said they would take him. "What do you want from me?" Andrew shouted at them. The voices went quiet, and just the labored breathing of what sounded like much larger beasts could be heard. Finally, they began again, only this time their voices were excruciatingly deep, thumping into his ears like too much bass. "We want to play with you. We want to be inside you. We want you inside us. We want to taste you. We want to be you." All these answers came simultaneously, booming in his head as if they were originating there. He heard them all individually, somehow, but wished he hadn't. He wished he hadn't asked the question. He wished he'd gone straight to the police station, in shackles or not. He wished he'd never gone on this damn trip. The pounding on his car began again, with more fervor than before. Violent blows assaulted the side windows, and as they began to crack, Andrew knew he had to get out of there. He crawled over the seats to get behind the wheel and started the car. When the headlights came on, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Shapes. Silhouettes. The light from his car did not touch these creatures, but he could see them through the illumination of the spaces between them, as if he were looking at a negative. They were the same size as children, only with pointed heads, and long arms that reached the ground like a gorilla. And those haunting, silver eyes, they seemed to pierce right through him, turning his blood jelly, his legs to stone, his mind to mush. Then there was the big one, the largest shape among them. It was the size of an elephant, maybe larger, 12 or 15 feet tall. Like a woolly mammoth, it appeared to be hairy too, unlike its smaller brethren. Its breath sent billows of smoke into the chill air. Somehow finding the strength, both in mind and body, to put the car in drive, Andrew floored it. Chaos erupted. Most of the little creatures dived out of the way. Some of them landed on his car and began pounding on the windshield, obscuring his view. He turned on the wipers, but they did nothing. The bastards ripped them off and started beating his hood with them. He pressed on, not wanting to stop, to allow them to get inside. Then, abruptly, violently, the car halted. He'd hit something. Maybe a building. Something that wasn't moving. Throwing the car into reverse, he backed away, feeling the car sway and lurch as he climbed over lumps that weren't there seconds before. The way they crunched and squealed, he assumed he was running over the vile creatures, and this brought him no small amount of satisfaction. When he could put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car barely moved. It slid around slightly, but seemed to have no traction. Reverse gear didn't improve the situation. He craned the wheel, trying to pry himself loose from whatever was holding the car, picturing piles of the black shadows under his wheels. He briefly wondered what color their blood was. Suddenly the car jerked, but not in the direction he wanted. The nose lifted and fell, and he fell back into his seat. Then he noticed the creatures were no longer on his hood, and his view was clear again, but he wished it wasn't. He was staring into the silver eyes of the giant beast. It must have lifted the car off the ground. Up close, the headlights still refused to offer any illumination. It was like peering into a void. The monster growled at him. As a last-ditch effort, Andrew remembered the dial on the dashboard. He switched it, turned on the vehicle's four-wheel drive, and punched the gas. The car jerked backwards, jumping out of the beast's grip, and tore away. He felt the bumps and jolts as he ran over more of the silver-eyed children. Then the ground fell out from under him, and that was the last thing he remembered. Andrew awoke, sore and groggy, staring at the morning sky. He was still behind the wheel of his car, which no doubt was also sore and groggy. Surveying his surroundings, he discovered he'd driven down an embankment, some 30 or so feet below the parking lot behind the gas station, and was resting against some trees and bushes. Most importantly, none of the creatures were around. He'd survived the night. Not that they'd simply vanished. More words had been painted on the windshield. Dreading the new, terrifying message that awaited him, Andrew climbed out of the vehicle and inspected the damage first. The rear end was a wreck, and possibly beyond repair. Glass all over the car was either cracked or shattered completely. Scratches and dents marred the steel everywhere he looked, and red/brown paint was splashed all over the undercarriage. It dawned on him then that it wasn't paint, but blood. The creatures had been leaving him messages written in their own blood. He shuddered at the thought. Ignoring the lack of bodies that should have been littering the ground all around him, he marched to the front to read his new, bloody message. Find you. Follow you. Take you. Andrew swallowed hard, certain that his next encounter with the Shadow Children would be his last. Where they would take him, and for what purpose, he couldn't say. Nor did he want to find out. But why hadn't they taken him yet? Why were they tormenting him? Not that he was going to complain, he was still alive after all. But how much longer did he have? He pondered whether or not to abandon his car. Perhaps it was marked, and they followed their blood trail. Andrew decided instead to get help. He would take up the officer's suggestion from last night and report the incident. He might even rub it in the man's face. See what happened because of you? I could be dead right now. The incline up the embankment was steep, and he knew his car wouldn't have made it up the hill even if it would start. He had difficulty climbing it himself, stiff and bruised as he was. The walk back to town felt longer than it should have. He tried to devise a way to explain the situation that wouldn't make him sound crazy, but nothing sounded plausible. And of course, when he found the police station and recounted the events over the past few nights, he was met with raised eyebrows and skepticism. They went out to the scene of the crime and surveyed the damage, assuming alcohol was involved. But because they had no proof, they couldn't press charges. They also couldn't explain the stuff that looked like paint all over his car, nor did they seem inclined to. They called a wrecker and had the vehicle hauled out and taken to the nearest garage at his expense. The damage was indeed considerable and would take a week or longer to repair. Andrew wondered again if he shouldn't just write it off. He found an overpriced hotel with a vacancy the next town over and was more than happy to spend the night there, sleeping on the decision. From there, he was also finally able to phone his wife and tell her what had happened. Rational as she was, she maintained that there had to be a logical explanation for it all. She told him to call back when he had the repair cost estimate, but he would never get one. A comfy bed and secure locks and windows did little to erase the memories of the last few nights, and Andrew slept fitfully. He jolted awake every other hour, thinking he'd heard a scratching sound or hushed voices, but he remained alone. In the early morning, he was awakened by a phone call from the garage telling him there had been an accident. An hour and a taxi ride later, he arrived to find his precious car crushed, nearly folded in half, and leaning against a tree. It looked like a piece of paper one had crumpled and thrown away. No one had any idea how it could have possibly happened. The shop owner had arrived that morning and discovered the wreckage. But Andrew knew who had done it, though he kept it to himself. He wondered if they'd destroyed the car because they couldn't find him. Or did that mean it was over? He wasn't marked. Otherwise, they'd have come for him at the hotel. Was he free from their haunting voices and stalking silver eyes? Or were there more words written in blood on his windshield, waiting to be unearthed for him to read? He certainly wasn't going to be keeping his car now, no matter the case. The next day, Andrew hopped aboard a bus and headed back to his wife, eager to put everything behind him. He decided to work from home from now on.
Divine Word of the Holy Trinity Commune, Utah, March 17th, 2023, St. Patrick's Day. And so the Lord said to them. Pastor John stopped mid-sentence, his eyes on the door to the church, or more so the man that opened it and stood in the doorway looking down the aisle at him. He was dressed in a fine button-down shirt, black dress slacks, and shoes with a long gray overcoat. His head is what stood out the most, as it was the head of a serpent, long-necked, scaled, and equipped with a slithering tongue. Either it was some kind of mask, a prank of sorts, or the devil had come to visit the pastor and his flock. Mark, Thomas, please close the doors. All heads turned at his words to see the strange man standing in the doorway. He didn't seem to regard them in return, or if he did, they couldn't tell. His beady reptilian eyes stared forward. The people in the pews, young and old alike, let out a unified gasp. Some began to murmur quietly, panicked, but having too much respect for God's house to be loud. The two men John had spoken to rose from their seats and cautiously approached the man. "Hurry now," Pastor John told them from his podium. "Be sure to lock it once it's closed, please. Thank you." His words stirred some of the more daring to speak out. "Lock it? You're going to lock us in. What is happening?" "I'm not locking you in," John said to the woman in the front row, glaring at him. Mary was always independent, even in the house of God. Blind trust had been hard for her, since the day she moved there and joined them. He had hope for her, though, and didn't want to show frustration. He did his best to always respond to her fears with reassurance. "I'm locking the devil out." He watched as Thomas and Mark reached the doors. The man in the center made no threats or sounds. He just stood where he was, staring forward, that thin forked tongue slithering about like the muscle itself was a serpent. "Please, step back," Thomas said as they each grabbed one of the large oak doors. "I'm sorry, but we need to close this. Perhaps you can come back later." Pastor John saw that Thomas was trying his best to be polite in order to keep from frightening the others and eliciting panic, but it was pointless. He could see how scared his family was already, and the words Thomas spoke came out trembling, like a child in the rain. "Just go," Mark said more forcefully. "Go back to wherever you came from." Pastor John and the rest of his community watched as Mark shoved the door toward the serpent-headed man. Thomas followed his lead and closed his as well, though more tentatively. The stranger didn't move. He still stood there, staring forward as the doors came towards him. Then at the last second before the eyes of God and all his children, he grabbed Mark, stepped backward, and yanked him out of the building as the doors fell shut. There was no stopping the shouting then. Mark's wife was in the mix. "Open the door!" she commanded, tears already shining on her cheeks. Pastor John knew he couldn't oblige her, though. Mark was one of the people that helped him build this church from the ground up and establish this community, but he couldn't risk everyone for one man. He rushed around the podium, down the steps of the stage, and into the aisle. "Do not open it," he said, his voice booming. "Lock it." "What?" Mark's wife, Margaret, bellowed. "You can't be serious," a man on the other side, Paul, said, standing up. His voice was angry. A woman stood up, then a few pews behind him. "Mark could be in danger," she growled accusingly. "We are all in danger," Pastor John said, doing his best to keep his voice even and the fear from his tone. God had entrusted him to lead these people. This was his most significant test in the 40 years he had been running this commune. He would not fail. "Now lock the door before someone else gets taken." A woman on the other side of the room said, "You can't just leave him out there." John ignored her and stared at Thomas. The poor man looked terrified but nodded, his red hair bobbing as he did, and he grabbed the large wooden beam they used to lock the door. Many of their ways were outdated, but John, Mark, and another man named Dennis, who had long since passed, built it all with their own two hands. They felt the old-style nature of things added to the power it commanded. A man in the back, Jeremy, jumped up to help Thomas with the door. Margaret left her pew and charged toward them, screaming. As the board fell into place, she fell to her knees before them, her body racked by sobs. "What did he want with my husband?" she cried. "What is he doing to him?" "I'm going through your office and leaving out the back," a woman named Teresa said firmly, daring him to contradict her. John sighed. He turned to face her and gave a calm retort. "If you do, then I will lock the door behind you. It is currently locked, and it needs to remain so. I cannot risk everyone in our family for your whims." "So you'll leave me to death as well?" she asked angrily. "If I must to protect everyone else, I cannot sacrifice the whole for the few. I'm sorry." "This is insane," she barked. "What if there are more of those things out there?" "There are more," Pastor John said matter-of-factly. "Well, they could be hurting Mark while we're all just sitting in here." "They are hurting him," John said again, his voice steady, his truth plain. "And you're okay with that?" a man named Peter said, jumping to his feet like so many others. "Of course not," his pastor said back, "but I cannot change it. What has been done has already been done. I need to accept it and do whatever I can to protect the rest of you." "Do you think that was really the devil?" someone shouted. "Not the devil himself, but definitely his followers. A pagan monster obsessed with a world that no longer exists." "Why us? Why here? What do they want? Who are they?" How many of those things are out there? Are they demons? The questions were coming from everywhere now. They were frantic and panicked. Pastor John raised his hands to quiet everyone. Let us secure the church, and I will do my best to answer your questions. What else can we do? Paul asked him. Make sure any windows that aren't stained glass are sealed and locked. Someone needs to check the wine cellar and make sure the door to the outside is locked from within. Paul, Thomas, and Mary took off to do as he said. John was glad for that. The few that acted quickly would calm the others and help him maintain control of this terrible situation. When they left, others went to the stained glass windows and did their best to peer through them, commenting on how they couldn't see anything clearly. John huffed quietly, but didn't say anything. How long will we be trapped in here? Jeremy asked. I don't handle being closed in well. I don't know, Pastor John said with honesty. You don't know? Someone else fired off. You can't keep us prisoner. This is mad. Would you prefer to go out there with them? Someone from across the room yelled back before John could even respond. Someone pointed upwards then. The pointer was a young woman, Michelle. She was Peter's daughter. John, as well as many others, followed the path of her finger. She was pointing towards the opening in the roof that let the sun in. Its golden beams fell directly onto the large cross that the Lord Jesus hung upon as penance for their sins. It looked truly holy and blessed the way the light made him shine, but that wasn't the reason for her to point this out to the others. Could they get up in there? She asked sheepishly. How would they get all the way on the roof? Someone responded. Snakes don't fly. Did the demons bring ladders? Maybe they can't get in that way, but we can get out, a man named James said as he bounded to his feet, squeezed past the others in his pew, and flopped out into the center aisle. We can see what's going on out there? Mark! Margaret shouted from her knees. She bowed her head once more, but this time it wasn't to cry. This time it was to pray. Many of the others joined in, and the room filled with prayer. John felt this was good. This was what they needed, to be bound together by their faith, to use it as a strength to combat the evil that had come to them and brought violence to their doorstep. Go with him, John said to Paul as James ran for the door to the stairwell. When he comes back in, slide the trap closed. They had a piece of wood that slid over the opening. He didn't like to block the sun, but they need to protect Jesus on the days of rain and snow. There was no lock on the sliding door, but perhaps it would at least be a deterrent. Why don't you go yourself? Someone asked angrily. Because if something should go wrong, it would leave you without leadership in a time of turmoil, Pastor John said evenly. God put me in this position as your mentor, your holy guide, and I will not forsake that, especially now. Peter's wife Anne stood then. I'll go, she said, working her way past the people sitting beside her. Be careful, John told her. Please tell me what's happening, Margaret said then, crawling towards her as she followed James to the stairs. Tell me if he's okay. Please, I must know. I will, Anne said with a frown. Then she ripped the door open and tramped up the stairs. The door swung shut, and the bang made everyone jump. They were on edge, and John couldn't blame them. Even still, their voices fell to a quiet murmur, and ultimately the room fell silent. They were all waiting to hear what James and Anne saw outside. John worried that they weren't even breathing. He walked the aisle and gave supportive pats and squeezes on the shoulders of the people he passed. He wanted to slow their racing hearts, to help them to feel safe as he had for so many years. Seconds ticked by like hours in the quiet church. John feared for the people that hadn't come to church this day. They were but a few, but they were out there nonetheless. Old man Henry had taken ill. He stayed in bed this morning. Had the snakes gotten to him? John felt like it was not even a question. He was sure the old man was dead. What about Claire and the little ones that remained at the house? She had yet to learn how to quiet their cries and didn't want them to disturb his sermon. They were set to receive private and personal counsel later in the day. She was having a hard time with the twins she wasn't expecting, and John did his best to accommodate the needs of his flock. The teenage boy, Michael, was in his necessary adolescent stage of rebellion and refused to come when his parents left for church. They had called John in a panic, and he told them not to worry. He was sure that Michael would come around in his own time, as they all did eventually. Now he feared that the boy wouldn't have a chance. Silently, Pastor John prayed for the safety of everyone that had stayed home today. They had gone through decades worth of St. Patrick's Days before this one, all of which were full of love and celebration, excitement and prayer. He had not ever seen this day coming, and he felt disappointed with himself for not being more prepared. He finished his prayer by asking God for forgiveness. When more time passed before James and Anne's return, the murmurs began to rise again, nerves taking control and paving the way for fear's release once more. John wondered if he should send someone to check on them. His reassuring walk down the aisles had turned into pacing, his fingers drumming on his leg as he went. His eyes remained focused on the opening in the roof. Then the door to the stairwell finally came open, and he whirled around with more anxiousness than he meant to display. "Pastor John," James said, his face serious, "I really think you should come up and see for yourself." "What does that mean?" someone cried out. "Is it Mark?" Margaret cried. "Tell me what you saw." Anne walked past James and went to Margaret. She helped the woman to her feet and walked her to a door at the front. It led to a hall where they had classrooms that they used for the religious instruction of the young. "Let's go speak privately," Anne said quietly, leading the woman along by holding her elbow with the other arm around Margaret's shoulders. This made people talk even more. "Pastor John," James said again. John nodded in his direction. "All right, everyone stay calm. I will go with James and return with haste." Thomas and the others returned then. "Everything is locked?" he asked them. "Yes, Pastor John," Thomas said. John nodded again. "All right. Thomas, why don't you lead them in prayer while I'm gone? Maybe Teresa will even lead us in song with that beautiful voice of hers. I know she could find just the right hymn to give our family the strength that we require during this hard time." Teresa looked annoyed, but she didn't offer a rebuttal. She made her way to the center of the room and stood beside Thomas. "I'll return quickly," John said quietly to them both. Then he followed James back through the door and up the stairs to the second floor. Abel, their organ player, was seated on his bench looking down at the congregation with a mask of worry. "Now would be a good time to play," John said, patting him on the back as they went by him. Abel didn't offer a verbal response. He let his hands answer for him as he turned around and let them find purchase on the keys before him. Immediately, the entire building was filled with music, the deep organ sounds reverberating off of the acoustics. Teresa took the cue and began to sing. She needed no microphone. Her voice commanded power even though the notes flowed with grace. "Show me," John said to James once he knew their voices could not be heard. "I know it is bound to be grim." "It's beyond grim," James said back. They went to the hole in the roof, and James cupped his hands to give Pastor John a boost. He wasn't a young man anymore, and there was no way he could climb out on his own as James had. He groaned with the effort, even with the assistance of the younger man. He came out upon the roof and hunched over, needing a breath before he could even look out at the scene beyond the church. When he lifted his head, he said, "God help us. Have mercy on us all." There, about 50 yards in front of the church's main entrance, Mark's naked body had been nailed to a crucifix. It wasn't just his clothes that were gone. His flesh was missing too. He had been flayed. All around the cross that ran with his friend's blood stood men and women wearing snake heads. They looked up at him as if they knew he was there watching. Pastor John gasped and stumbled backward, almost falling through the hole that got him up there. He caught himself at the last moment and panted for breath. When he stepped forward and looked at the crowd of murderous serpents again, he saw the jagged oyster shells in their hands, and at once he understood the significance. He heard the statement they meant to make with Mark's displayed death. Pastor John hurried back to the hole. He had trouble getting back inside, even with James's help, as his limbs were shaking. He was going to have trouble displaying confidence for his people when he made it back downstairs. They needed him now, but he was shaken to the core. In his mind, he prayed on a loop, begging God to take care of them. "It's horrible," he said when James helped him to sit down on the floor. "Please close it. Don't let anyone else out there. Poor Mark. Poor Mark. May the Lord take care of him now." As James did as he asked, closing the lid and cutting off the light of the sun, dropping the statue of Jesus below into the shadow of darkness, he said, "It's disgusting, but what does it mean? Why are they doing this? Who are they?" "They're Hypatians," John said to him before quickly putting a fist to his mouth. "I think I'm going to be sick." The vision of Mark's skinless form nailed to that cross was etched into his mind and refused to leave. What was worse was the movie of what he didn't get to actually see that his imagination created for him. He saw those monsters cutting into Mark's buttocks, back, and chest with their jagged oyster shells. He saw them reaching into the cuts and peeling his flesh from his body in large, unmarred strips. It was enough to send him over the edge. He turned away from James, dropped to his knees, and vomited. "I'll get the mop and bucket," James said to him. Pastor John nodded, not trusting himself to speak without throwing up again. He had to get himself composed somehow. The snakes would be here all night, and John had to do all he could to keep his family alive. He could mourn Mark's loss later. His heart broke for Margaret, and he was glad that Anne had taken her away from the others before telling her that her husband was gone. They had been married since they were teenagers. They met here when they were young and eager Christians following John on his mission. The couple was the definition of becoming one soul in marriage as God intended. Now half of that one was gone in the most gruesome way John could even imagine. Come morning, if the snakes left, John would have to have someone keep Margaret in the building while he worked to get Mark down. He couldn't allow her to see him like that. She would never come back from that. Before he could even think of how to do that, though, he had to make sure they made it through the night. His eyes fell upon the lockless board that blocked the sun and felt suddenly vulnerable. Maybe he could find something in his office to make a lock with. As he thought about it, James returned with the mop and bucket and worked to clean up his sickness. "God thanks you, and so do I," John told him. "Who are the Hypatians?" James asked as he wrung the mop out. "I will explain it to everyone at once," the pastor answered. "I can't keep our family in the dark any longer. They have a right to know what we are up against and to understand the gravity of the threat that stands at our gates." James didn't say anything. He just gave a slight nod of his head and continued to mop the floor. When he was done and John got to where he could stop trembling, they made their way back. As they passed Abel, John said to him, "You may as well come with us, my loyal friend. There is no need for you to be up here by yourself. Come on down." Abel didn't say anything, but he stopped playing and got up from the bench to follow them to the stairs. He glanced back at his organ as if the instrument was in danger before going down the stairs. Abel was John's uncle. He was almost 80 and had been the organ player for the entirety of their community's existence. His own wife had passed a year ago, and they never had children of their own. The organ must feel like family to him, John surmised. He understood. He felt for every board and nail, not just in this church, but in the houses and outhouses as well. They were all the fruit of his labor and a testament to his faith. When they re-entered the main room, they made their way to the room's center, and John patted Thomas and Teresa on the back in silent thanks. They parted and stepped away. James helped Abel to a nearby seat. Pastor John took a deep breath, and then he began. "This is not the sermon I intended to give today, but it is the story I must tell, for the devil attempts to destroy us as we sit in here. Please do not interject. Hold your questions, and I will answer them all to the best of my ability at the end. We must keep our resolve and our faith strong and stand together on this day. Let me get an amen." "Amen," the congregation responded, though it sounded as if their hearts weren't completely in it. He led them again and again until there was power in that singular spoken word. Only then did he move on. "In the beginning, the word of God was not easily received. Christianity was not simply accepted. The heathens of this world would have preferred to maintain their baby-killing ways rather than embrace the one true God as their Lord and Savior. Instead of allowing Jesus into their hearts, they sacrificed their own children to false gods. They ate human flesh and lived like demons on earth. We had to fight for Christianity, fight in the name of God to bring this world into a time of compassion and love, to create a world of civilized people that didn't behave like the devil's flock. And we did. We won. The pagans were pushed out and conquered in the name of God Almighty. One of the mightiest heroes in this fight was St. Patrick, who drove the snakes out of Ireland. The snake was a pagan symbol. The serpents legends spoke of were heathen humans, not actual snakes. "Is that why those things are here?" Mary demanded to know. "Is this something about St. Patrick?" "Please, let me finish," John said in answer. "I will explain all that I know. If you still have questions when I am done, then you will be free to ask them." He paused and waited a moment. When Mary said nothing else, he took a deep breath and continued. "The final act in our victory over the pagan beasts was the felling of a prophet of theirs. The Romans had already bested most of the Druids, and none of them put their teachings in writing. Their blasphemy was exchanged only by word of mouth, so when those mouths were silenced, so was their evil. There was a woman, a teacher they deemed a philosopher. Her name was Hypatia. She was the line that kept strong the pagan faith until our monks killed her and displayed her body for her people to see. It was brutal, but they needed to know that they had lost, and it worked. The message had gotten across. Paganism died with Hypatia. For a long time, anyway. There was a singular sect that continued on in secret. They called themselves the Hypatians in her name. They continued to spread the word of their fallen druids and keep alive their archaic travesties. Their numbers grew, and the Pope tried to seek them out and eradicate them, but he was never able to find them. Once a year on St. Patrick's Day, they don serpent heads and seek to murder Christians as we murdered their leader and teacher. As St. Patrick rid the snakes from Ireland, they intend to rid the God-fearing, good-hearted Christians from everywhere. They are mad zealots. They are disgusting, dangerous, and horrifically violent, and they are here, just outside our doors." After a breath, Mary deemed it okay to speak and said, "This is mad. The Pope never even sanctioned Patrick. He's not a true Christian saint. Why would they punish us for his sins?" "Don't you get it?" Paul snapped. "This is a war that has been fought for centuries." "Then why don't we fight?" Peter said, rising to his feet. "Let's take arms and show them, as our ancestors did, who the true God is." "What exactly do you mean to do that with?" Michelle asked shyly. "We are locked in a church." "She's right," said Pastor John. "We don't have access to weapons unless we leave here and go to our homes, and those killers stand between, and they are already armed." "Armed with what, though?" James asked. "It looked like shells." John nodded. "Oyster shells. That's what our own monks used to play Hypatia. It was a brutal time back then." "Dear God," someone said. "I heard they also cut her arms and legs off," said an older woman to his right. "Drove her limbless body through town, burning it." Murmurs rose and people sounded as if they were going to be sick. "As I said, it was a brutal time," Pastor John told them as he worked to regain control of the room. "But it's no wonder they hate us," a woman named Catherine offered. "The sins of the father are the sins of the son. Violence begets violence, and so on." "The hell with that," a man shouted back. "That was hundreds of years ago. It has nothing to do with us." "No matter what you feel or believe, they are out there, and they mean us harm. I had heard of them sacking churches and killing congregations in the past, but it seemed more of a horror story meant to frighten than a reality. I never imagined they would show up at our door." "I'm sorry." Pastor John sighed. He felt so tired. His shoulders slumped. The visions of Mark's skinned body nailed to a cross kept pushing their way back into his mind. "I believe if we can make it till morning when St. Patrick's Day is over, they will leave." Outrage rose among his flock. "So we're expected to stay here all night, locked in like goats in a pen? What about my family? They're home. I need to get to them. What are we supposed to do if they get in?" "They hurt our crops, our cattle, the chickens?" Pastor John rubbed some of the tension from his face. "I don't know. I don't know in detail what they will do or what their intentions are. I don't know what they have already done to our homes or family members that aren't with us in this room. I do know, however, what they have already done to Mark, and it is something that will plague my dreams for however many days I have left. I cannot in good conscience allow any of you to leave. This commune is mine. You are all my responsibility. This is the best way I know to keep you safe." A man in the back stood up then. "You cannot keep us here as prisoners. If we want to leave, we have that right. My stubborn son refused to come today, and you said he would be all right. For all I know, he could be dead already. I'm going to him, and you're not going to stop me." "He's right," another man said. "My wife Claire is home with my twins. How can I stay here, tucked safely away while they could be getting hurt? I have to go home, Pastor John." John exhaled his frustration. He understood how they felt. He believed they were already too late to save any of their loved ones from the heathens outside, but how could he keep them from trying? "All right," he said. "Anyone who needs to check on loved ones will go out the back door in my office. Thomas will lock it behind you, and James will watch you from the roof, so we will know if you make it or not. That is the best I can offer." The people talked amongst themselves for a minute and ultimately came to agree upon that plan. 4 men and 2 women left out the back door, and Thomas went to lock the door behind them. James did as his pastor requested and went back up to the roof to see what transpired from a place that seemed reasonably safe. The rest waited in numb silence. Pastor John began to worry when Thomas didn't return, but he feared going to check. If Thomas failed to lock the door, then the snakes could already be inside. If he went to check, it could mean his death. Just the same, he couldn't, in good conscience, send someone else to what could be their death. The door to the stairwell banged open and James stumbled out. He was white as a ghost and stepped like he was drunk. "None of them made it," he said. "None of them. Those pagans move like actual serpents. They are lightning fast and slippery. They broke ranks and dispersed, catching everyone and dragging them off into the trees out of sight." Pastor John hung his head. His heart felt heavy. So much of Utah was desert and red rock. He chose to build up north by one of the temperate forests so they would have more access to animals and vegetation as they planned to be self-sustaining. Now that choice gave the serpents in their midst somewhere to hide. Michael's mother stood in the back of the room. "I have to go. They have my husband. I have to go." Pastor John shook his head. "No, I'm sorry. I can't let you. Do you think you will make it where they did not? Your husband is as good as dead, and you will only join him if you go too." "How could you say that?" she screamed. "Because it's the truth," Mary said across the room to her. "Where's Thomas?" Peter asked then, voicing John's own fears. "Thomas never came back," someone else echoed. "Where's Thomas?" John looked to James for the answer, but the other man only shook his head. "I didn't see him. I'm sorry." "I'll check," Jeremy said. "Wait," John said, stopping him with a raised hand. "We should go with several people and have greater numbers in case there is a threat. I will lead the way." Several of his God-made family filed in line behind him, and he slowly made his way toward his office. His heart was in his throat, and he couldn't find breath. When he reached the office, he opened the door and stepped inside. Jeremy and the others poured in to surround him. The back door was wide open, and Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Why didn't they come in and get us?" Jeremy asked quietly. "Maybe they want us to be afraid," Michelle said. "They can go back to hell," Peter chimed in. "What do you think they did to Thomas?" a woman named Elizabeth said. "I don't know," Pastor John said with quiet honesty. The image of Mark's flayed corpse returned behind his eyes. Slowly he approached the open door. The others hung back and watched with bated breath. Pastor John reached the open door and stepped into the doorway. He peered out at the trees beyond and immediately lost his footing, falling to his knees, even as his hands grasped either side of the door jamb. "What is it?" someone said from behind him. "Go, get back, get out of here, don't look," he commanded them. Mary stepped forward anyway as she was prone to go by the beat of her own drum. She bent over to lift him back to her feet, and he saw her eyes fall upon the scene that took his legs. She froze where she was. "I told you to go," he said to her, his voice weak. She didn't respond. She just stood there, bent over him, staring out at Thomas. His abdomen had been slit open and his intestines wrapped around a tree. He was being led by serpent-headed people in a walk around that tree, his intestines pulling out more and more as he went and winding around the base of the tree like an invasive vine. Thomas looked their way then. "Go," he croaked. "How, in God's name, is he alive?" Mary asked. "He could live for hours still," Pastor John told her, his sickness evident in his tone. "He's right, we have to go." Mary didn't say anything, but she finished the task she set out to do and lifted him to his feet. They leaned on each other as they made it back into the room. Then John slammed the door shut and locked it. His face was pale and beaded with sweat when he looked back at the others that backed to the office door but never went through it. "Is Thomas dead?" Michelle asked. "Not yet, but he will be soon enough and we can't save him." Mary was the one to answer. Pastor John could barely stand. "What are we going to do?" Jeremy asked then. John simply shook his head. "We're going to wait. It's all we can do. We can't open the doors or windows anymore. We can't go out. All we can do is wait and pray for them to leave." Everyone looked shaken and frightened, but no one offered any argument. Pastor John was glad for this because he didn't have the energy to fight them if they did. They walked back to the main room. As they did, a stained glass window to the left shattered inward, and several people screamed and shouted. Two all too human arms came through and seized Paul, pulling him up the wall and through the broken glass to the outside. A serpentine head peered through at them, black eyes staring and forked tongue lashing before it too disappeared. Some people ran to the broken window to look for Paul, but most scattered and ran away from it. Pastor John could do nothing but watch. "They're forcing some kind of metal rod through his heels by his Achilles tendons," Peter yelled, his voice cracking. "Dear God, they're stringing him up, upside down. They're treating him like a slab of meat." "Get away from the window," John screamed then. "Stop watching. It's sick. Leave it." "But he's one of us," Peter said. "He's family." "And he's dead. Leave it. Respect him enough not to watch such a thing." "He's right," Anne said, returning without Margaret. "Leave it, please." Paul was Anne's brother. Peter looked like he wanted to protest, but he didn't put a sound to it. Instead, he frowned and stepped away from the window. "Stay away from all the windows unless you see one of those things trying to come through," Jeremy said. "If they try to come in, we have to keep them out, but we don't want anyone else grabbed." Pastor John nodded his agreement as Mary helped him to the stage and he sat on its edge. Everyone else took seats in the pews. For the most part, they didn't even speak. Maybe they were like John and waiting for something big, for the monsters to come through the ceiling or bang at the front door until it broke. They all looked nervously towards the broken window every now and then, but nothing else appeared at it. Time passed at a crawl. It was a terrible thing to be waiting for death, even if you were as devout as Pastor John. He believed in heaven and what joy waited for him after his passing, but he wasn't prepared for the suffering that would send him there at the hands of the serpents beyond his walls. He couldn't help thinking about Thomas. Mark, he was sure, was dead. but Thomas could just be suffering, tied to that tree by his own entrails in excruciating pain. John prayed for him to pass quickly and join the Lord's flock in heaven. "Why us?" someone asked then. "I don't understand. We don't bother anyone. We live out here by ourselves, and we just live a simple life of quiet, joyful servitude." John didn't have the energy to answer. He just sat on the stage's edge with his head hung over his chest, praying silently behind closed eyes. Mary answered for him. "That is why. Because we're out here by ourselves, away from everything, ripe for the picking. It would be harder to attack a church in a busy, bustling city with police and everyone just around the corner and a million witnesses. We're prime targets." "God help us all," someone else said. "Wait, do you smell that?" Anne said loudly. "It smells like smoke." This made John raise his head. Their church was hand-built. It was in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't stone and mortar. It was wood. The wood was treated, but it would still burn, just not as quickly. He smelled it too. When he hopped down from the stage, he found many of the others were also on their feet. They were looking upward. The second floor was smoking. "That's why they didn't come in the open door," Pastor John said. "My organ," Abel said sadly. "I'm sorry," someone said, hugging the old man. "What are we going to do?" someone asked. "How much time do we have?" "If we leave, we'll just be caught like the others." "Are we all going to die?" "Pastor John." "Pastor John." "Pastor John." "I don't know," he screamed then. When the others felt quiet, he repeated it in a hushed tone. "I'm sorry. God trusted me. You all trusted me, and I've failed you. I don't have the answers. It will take time for the building to burn, but the smoke will choke us before then. We will have to flee, and they'll be waiting." "Maybe if we all leave at the same time, we'll be too many for them," Peter said. "They'll catch some of us, but many of us will make it." "We have no idea how many of those monsters are actually out there," someone said in answer. "Do you have anything better?" someone else chimed in. "If all they have is broken shells, I say we rush them," Mary said then. "It is possible that we do outnumber them. We could wind up getting the better of them. It's St. Patrick's Day. Let's do like St. Patrick and run the snakes out of here." People murmured quietly at first, but then the excitement rose until everyone was on their feet cheering and feeling empowered. John felt like they were probably going to die either way. They might as well go out in a blaze of glory. "Let's do it," he said. Already people were coughing on the smoke that was beginning to fill the room. The people filed into the aisle and waited as Peter and Anne removed the lock from the door. "What about Margaret?" she said. "She's sleeping in one of the classrooms." "I'll get her," Michelle said, heading that way. John didn't say it, but he knew she wasn't going to make it. The moment she saw Mark, she would collapse and they would get a hold of her. People were covering their mouths and noses with elbows and shirt collars, and still they coughed and choked, especially the elderly. "Are we ready?" Peter asked when Michelle returned, practically carrying Margaret, who looked like the shadow of the woman she once was. "Ready," Mary answered. Peter and Anne tore the doors open and everyone rushed out of the building, battle cry on their lips. That cry died away quickly when they all saw how futile it was. The serpents were everywhere, their scales shining in the blazing Utah sun. Pastor John just stood in front of his church, frozen in defeat as chaos ensued all around him. His people screamed and ran in every direction, and they all ran into the waiting arms of snakes. Some fought and even won, but more snakes would join and they were ultimately overwhelmed, disappearing beneath a pile of bodies and slithering forked tongues. Some of the congregation was killed outright, their deaths made quick, but many were taken to be killed slowly in some form of ancient torture like John's friends before them had been. Death was all around him, and he could do nothing but watch and wait for his own turn. St. Patrick died in his sleep at a very old age for the time, but that would not be the case for Pastor John, and he knew it. His death would be anything but peaceful. All around him were the screams of his people, the people he loved, and the community he created. They screamed in terror, in agony, in battle. The serpents, however, said nothing. They spoke only through violence, through pain and death, and yet their message was as clear as day. Vengeance does not die as easily as man. It lives on, breeds, evolves, gestates, and continues until it is fulfilled. Hands came from every direction then and seized him. He didn't bother to fight. Coal-black serpentine eyes of glass on the masks of his murderers were everywhere, staring at him lifelessly. He couldn't help but wonder how they made their tongues whip and move like that. Were their actual tongues forked and split? Pastor John just closed his eyes and prayed to God to receive him with open arms and welcome him into his kingdom. He felt himself being dragged away then, through the cries and screams of his loved ones. They tied his arms and legs and dragged him away from all that he had built. He refused to open his eyes. Only when he hit something hard and solid did he dare to look. He found himself in a boat. It was a small rowboat the length of a single man. His head was sticking out of a cut in the top of it. One of the snakes forced milk down his throat and it filled his nose, choking him. Another followed suit with honey. He knew enough about history to know what they were doing, and he let loose his own scream as they put an upside rowboat of equal size over the top of him, encapsulating him in a shell like a walnut. He watched in horror as they bolted it down. Only his milk and honey-covered head was exposed. "This is not pagan," he cried at them. "This was done by the Persians. It's all wrong." It was a strange thing to argue when he was being sent to his death, but for some reason it mattered to him. Maybe it was because he had nothing else left. Then one of the serpents removed their mask and Pastor John fell silent. It was her. It was impossible, but it was her. "Hypatia," he said quietly. "I have learned many great techniques from others that were mutilated and condemned to death by the Greeks and Romans, Persians, and the like. When I found my way back from death, brought to life by the faith of my druids, I brought so much knowledge with me on how to kill. You would be amazed." Pastor John could say nothing. He could only stare at the woman who had been violently murdered so long ago. "The strange thing is, I was just a philosopher. I taught pagans and Christians alike until your people murdered me. Your Saint Patrick was a tyrant and a torturous murderer too. You all act like you are betters, but look at what you did to me simply for being a learned woman." The image of her changed then, and Pastor John found himself staring up at the charred remains of a fleshless corpse, blackened and limbless. Her eyes remained, staring at him with hatred. He screamed then. He screamed with all he had until his open mouth was filled with flies, attracted to the sweetness of the milk and honey. "Congratulations on being right," Hypatia said to him as he choked on insects. "Your hell is real. I would know. Now you get to join me in the flames and burn as your ancestors burned me. But first, you will be food for the flies, bees, and worms. It will be slow and painful, and I will be waiting for you when it's all over. Me, not your God. Me." There must have been cuts in the top boat because Pastor John could feel more milk and honey being poured in over his body. He felt the bugs follow suit, and he cried as he was pushed out into the Great Salt Lake. He prayed for her to be wrong, for God to embrace him and forgive him his failures. He prayed for the Lord to save his soul. He wouldn't know if the Lord would answer those prayers, though, until death finally came, and that would take days, several horrible days of being eaten bit by the tiniest mouths available. In the distance, the cries of his friends and family rang on, and he could do nothing but listen to their horrible anguish. He wept until the sun dried his eyes, and he couldn't produce tears any longer. He closed his eyes and focused on the buzzing that surrounded him because it was a better sound than the screams. This was all there was and all there would be until he got to find out what came after. And if he was right about hell, he prayed he was right about heaven too. He remembered Hypatia's words, though, even as he prayed against them. "It will be me waiting for you, not your God. Me."
What shall I love, if not the Enigma. Giorgio de Chirico. 1. The yellowed scrap might once have been printer paper, the cheap kind you pay $5 for in some overly bright big-box palace of soulless depravity. I halted, stooped, and plucked it from the ground. Where is this? 3 words scrawled in thickly black ink, as if from some old fountain pen. I squinted in the dim light, but could not determine whether the message had been lost hours or years ago. Holding it up to my nose, I sniffed, grimaced at a briny reek akin to battery acid, or something dead and white glaring from a jar of cloudy formaldehyde. Bad enough my hands still trembled from the medication, though I'd been off it for a month. Now this, whatever it was. Already the crazed wheels of obsession whirled in my mind. Don't sink, I told myself. Let it go. Swallowing hard, I crumpled the scrap and fed it to the wind. Some bitter residue soured my tongue, but I ignored it. Probably another of Dr. Wagner's phantoms, an echo of last year's gray vacation in room 310 beneath the starling-scratched eaves. I wondered whether I could ever forgive myself for what I'd done to Emily. The goddamned wind shocked a willow looming over the path, scoured my face with ice pellets. Something skittered past my boot, wedged itself between a frosty twig and a stone. I crouched to retrieve it until I realized the crumpled message had followed me, its inky question mark isolated by a crease. Don't sink. Let it go. Wagner's mantra, or chant, against all melancholy, anguish, and black spiders of paranoia. You're much too hard on yourself, he told me, with grating buoyancy. Can't you see that? You're out of the clinic, but still tormenting yourself for something we both know never happened. Oh, yes, it did. I was there. Saw her terror. Her pretty face in that lightless place. Don't sink, I yelled. Fuck. I hope no one heard that. Get me sent back to the house of despair. I would not cry either. Her name surged through me, cold, creeping horror, as if the trees had eyes. Quickening my step helped silence the urge to rhyme. Face, place, space. And I headed for Drake's neon Heineken sign, glowing green through branches clawing empty air. My boot crunched ice and slid left. I toppled, thrusting out a hand to break the fall. The impact sledgehammered my shoulder, palm grinding jagged ice and leaves like parchment. After a few seconds, I sat straight, breath gushing white into the gloom. Nothing broken. Lucky break, I guess. Ha fucking ha. I peeled a leaf from my palm and saw I held another paper scrap. Night's gusty invasion webbed the thing in shifting shadow. More snow on the way. Hands stinging. I stood and moved on. Finally, the path opened onto the sidewalk. Pausing, I brushed pine needles and dirty snow from my jeans and jacket, lumbered toward a streetlight arching over the bus stop. I must have looked like some tweaking twit trying to decipher a grocery list. You deserve it. I tossed the message and it drifted along the sidewalk. Nothing. It was nothing. Time for a drink. For Emily. 2. A hushed room, institutional bed, her black hair adorned with fish bones stolen from dinner. Green buttons threaded there too, so when the others come looking for things in the night, they'll recognize her. White as the moon, delicate hand clutching spikes swiped from the maintenance room, one for each limb. Jasmine aura, a haunt of misery. Rain ticking the window. Each peck, a dead star, back from oblivion. Her awful cry, hearing the magnitude of her exile. Lavender lips whispering, how did this happen? How? Take me back. How? She doesn't know where she is, Doctor. Why don't you believe that? You're a very sick man. These sessions aren't helping the obsessive behavior. Don't sink. Let it go, torturing yourself. Let it go. You deserve better. No. She ran out of her room. She's in the attic. Right now, talk to her. Look, enough. Just go back to your room. Try to sleep. 3. Drake's was a letdown, but it beat the piss out of trudging through cold darkness back to the apartment. There, a relentless subsonic drone stalked me like some invisible machine. Ever since. Well, worse, every time I ran water, its hissing rush carried Emily's voice. When I wanted to hear Eclectopia or World Cafe on the radio, I must be vigilant as hell to squelch any intruding static. For white noise, too, is a carrier. Oh, Jesus Christ. The stuff I heard, whispered. Things in the night keep looking, things. My luminous music in trees, black snow, and bones of home. That's what it sounds like to me. As if something's tapping Emily's dreams. Or nightmares. I write down everything I hear. It's real. Fuck what Dr. Wagner says. It's real. As real as my love for Emily. She'll start saying the right things and tell me our love is infinite. I just know it. As soon as I find the proper frequency or some other way to communicate. She has that kind of mind, churning with energy, a sender. I learned a lot at Duke, working with Hansen. When I find out where Wagner, former CIA mind control monster, and his spooky pals in Defense Intelligence stashed her, I will rain unholy hell onto them. A real ego freak, that Wagner. When I was locked up in the house of despair at Willow Acres while you stalked raving sing types, I boosted someone's laptop from the employees' lounge and spent all of 10 minutes finding the shit on Herr Wagner. Youngest German genius, slicing brains and freezing alive old and young alike at ye old Dachau Inn. Pushing 90 now and barely a limp. Those merciless gray eyes. I wonder how long it took CIA linguists to neutralize the accent. Not drunk enough. Ever since the heavy meds, my alcohol tolerance is amazing. For what that's worth. And tired of catching weird looks from a few people at the bar, I ended up in my place after 1 a.m. Weepy and afraid of even being alive. The lacerating enigma of Emily turning in my mind like a dark galaxy. I opened a bottle of Matahari absinthe and took a few hits. The dark galaxy fizzed green. My only friend might be awake, so I called him. Martin can't come to the phone right now, said his answering deal. He's too busy not burning out. You know what to do. Beep. Marty, it's me. Pick up, please. You have 7 lucky seconds. I'd like to talk to you. Duh. You now have none seconds. Call me. And that was that. My other so-called friends had demonstrated their social integrity by clicking the "can't have my hipster cred menaced by appearing in public with emotionally disturbed acquaintance" option. So I read a lot. I watched too many movies and avoided thinking about having to find a job when my benefits ran out in 8 months. I snatched an old cassette, "Pornography" by The Cure, from my rack and slotted it into the deck. The cassette slid only part way, and when I yanked it out, a yellowed scrap of paper followed, flitted to the carpet like a jaundiced butterfly. "The fuck?" I said. Probably. Rising dread chilled me, and I immediately forced myself to read the thing. Found a way back in. 10:10, 11:11, 12:12, 1:11, 2:22, 3:33, 4:44, 5:55. Times to watch. Others might have followed. 4. After that message, I killed about half the Matahari. I had to sleep, but the old spiders of paranoia pricked my mind with dreadful ideas. The worst among them, Emily wasn't real, had emerged from my haunted, wild unconscious. Wagner had hinted at this. Anima, the woman within all men. Your obsessions and personality disintegration needed to create Emily, you see. Not a not unheard of phenomenon. Carl Jung, I believe, first identified this. Yeah, sure. Talking major hallucinatory scenario here, and the test showed I was not schizophrenic. Simply, quote, normal. Upfucked. If that was the case, well, then who wrote the messages? And, excepting the one shoved into my ancient cassette player, how did this anima make certain they'd fall into my hands? Or my hand fall onto them? Wagner knew nothing of these, even though I found the first on my way back from our weekly evening council in his lavish home study. Aware of my office phobia, Wagner offered this fussy service solely for my benefit. Fine with me, but I'd wager he's recording the sessions in pursuit of some arcane agenda. Why do I see a head shrinker whose past deeds are utterly reprehensible? Talk to my goddamn insurance company about that. Plus, I have my own covert agenda regarding Herr Wagner. In the early afternoon, I woke with an absinthe hangover which did nothing to improve the effect of the subsonic droning that once in a while rattled glasses in my kitchen cabinet. Heating milk in the microwave for coffee, I noticed the time. 2:22. My landline rang, and I flinched. Probably Marty. No one, not counting Wagner, called here but Marty. Hello? A vast, rushing wash, as if the caller stood near an ocean or inside some cavernous structure. Hello? What the hell? After a few moments, I realized the sound was not coming from any beach. My shy caller breathed with some difficulty or affectation. Where is this? Jesus Christ. A guttural male voice. Profoundly deep. My heart thumped in my ears, agonized my head. Where's what? A low throbbing beat, quick as my heart, then a cloggy drain sucking. Or something. My luminous music. And gone. Not even a dial tone. I stood there, dizzy, breath gushing, and slammed down the handset. The toilet was light years distant, and I made it there in time to hunch and convulse and choke out a hot green ribbon reeking of anise and alcohol. I hugged the porcelain goddess for a few minutes and slowed my heart and breathing. Leaning over the sink, I rinsed and spat and rinsed and spat. Forget mouthwash, too much like absinthe. Cold water shocked my face, and in that gurgling swish, I heard Emily. Minus music, my luminous 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 music. Emily! I twisted the tap, gazed blankly while 7 grudging drips christened the scarred drain flange, which some past renter had brutalized with a screwdriver or a knife, a stigmata of rage and futility. Fright tangled my hungover nerves, and I cleansed my lips and hands with gel sanitizer. No way I would run water again. Coffee saturated the kitchen air, such as it was. Pouring a cup, I could feel the subsonic tone in my heels. Muted behind the cabinet door, glasses vibrated against each other. Feigning indifference, I counted the drone's duration and sipped coffee. After 88 seconds, the assault ended. Somehow, during the intense concentration of the counting, I'd emptied my cup. The chipped relic from my college days would sit unwashed. No tap could be opened, for I feared hearing Emily's voice. If I needed to flush the toilet, I must make sure music blasted from my stereo to cover the agonizing sigh as the tank refilled. Peering into the refrigerator for bottled water, I ran numbers through my head. The awful voice had called the landline at 222. The subsonic attack vibrated my heels and thrift store glasses for 88 seconds. That's 222 plus 88 equals 310. My cloistered, disinfected, stinking room with brown blood spatter on the ceiling in the house of despair was numbered 310. Then I knew. 6. Anyone could see the pattern, even me. The yellowed paper scraps were gathered, concealed, and by way of some found or stolen fountain pen, inscribed by Emily's pale, green-veined hand, the underlying oneness in all confusions. That blurted into my mind, leftovers from the old job looking for ghosts in overfed houses. Please fuck off, Charles Fort. I regret ever reading your books. I had no idea how Emily had conspired to deliver the messages to me, the one responsible for her abduction by Wagner and his cult of atrocity. 5. Marty rang my annoying buzzer while I sat watching Chelsea Wolfe singing Feral Love, her eyes blank black ovals like oil. The hell, man, Marty said, thumping his boots on my mat. You look like shit. Ha ha, if the look fits. He dropped a brown paper grocery bag on the kitchen counter. What's up? Interest you in a Yingling beer product? Yeah. His green army jacket emanated fried food. How's biz at Flying Saucers? I asked as he shoved cans into the fridge. And Moody still ogling that Russian woman who makes the killer pizza? Marty snapped one open, sipped, and nodded. Ha! You know it. Can't blame him. Cat is hot. I know. More legs than a bucket of chicken. We both laughed and stepped into the living room. God damn, Marty said, staring at the TV. Who's she? Chelsea Wolfe. New to me, but I can't stop looking at her. Weird. It's like alien DNA or something. Wow. He slumped onto the couch. I felt strange him seeing my sort of Emily projection, so I killed the video and slotted a Bad Religion DVD. Marty stood, removed his reeking coat, and slung it across the couch back. "So, how's it going with Herr Wagner?" I sipped beer, my stomach rebelling. Liquid Valium. "Same Nazi, different day. I think he's secretly recording our sessions." "Really? Is that not cool? I mean, don't they all?" I regretted the admission. I don't know. If he is, I'm not crazy about it." "Oh, well, hell with him. How are you?" I took a good hit, clunked my beer onto the coffee table. "Oh, better than last month, but going outside is still a problem." Marty smacked my knee. "Hey, I know you. I do. You'll get back to the old pain-in-the-ass Weisenheimer we all know and love. Don't sweat it, man." "Sure." Fuck. Thanks for saying that. You need another one?" "Yeah, I'll take another. You thought much about work? I mean, what you might do? I know you're not down with going back to Duke and lab. North Carolina. Can't blame you." Back with beer as I sat. "I've been thinking I might approach Moody." "Seriously?" "Yeah, I can handle the line, and Moody sure as shit can handle a Culinary Institute dropout." Marty nodded, a bit aggressively. Sipped. Sure you can. I can see it. But, the pay... Fuck the pay. I'll get by." Marty watched Greg Graffin yank the microphone from its stand. "Moody has high expectations. You sure the physical effort won't nail you?" I wanted him to leave. A sensation of false hope fluttered in my chest and a depressive gravity. "I'll start running again. Whatever it takes. I know he's got major turnover with the line cooks." "Well, that he does. You want me to drop a ref for you?" Now it felt real. "You've only been working there for, what, 6 months?" 8, but I'm on his good side. Ever since beating Johnny in that egg frying contest last month." "Oh, okay. Yeah, let him know I'm interested." "Oh, God." Marty nodded again. "Hey, you want to hit Drake's?" "I'll bite." "Nope. No. I'm putting together resumes later." A shrug. "Yeah, cool." He turned and looked at me. "Rob, man, is it okay that I'm here? You can tell me anything. I won't get pissed or get all ass-holiness on you." For a moment, I considered telling him about the yellowed messages, the pursuing subsonic drone that rattled my drinking glasses. No. It's good to see you. The others, well, you know how they feel." He slammed his beer onto the table. "Fuck them. Rob, man, they are assholes of the purest sort, and they always were. They come into saucers and look at me like I'm a third-class loser. Okay, you're right. They suck. I don't miss them." That was too loud. Marty mashed his lips as if he'd said the wrong thing. "Fucking Greensburg, man. You're in or you're out with the new cool. Fucking hate it. You've got a mind. I just think you might be wasting it sweating over Moody's grill." At that moment, I could have hugged Marty. Maybe. But I gotta get off my ass and do something physical and get paid for it. "See? I hear the old defiant dude in there, and I like it. The physical shit will help, that I know. You need to get out of this bunker. Get used to outdoors. Nothing out there can hurt you." My turn to nod, however falsely. We drank a few more, and around midnight, Marty stood. "Gotta be back for breakfast service in the old golden morning. Keep the yingies, man. They'll help with resume writing." I stood. "They always do. Thanks for hanging out." Marty pulled on his jacket. You got it. I'm already thinking how fun it'll be if Moody schedules us together. You think of it. Bad jokes, rude comments about Billy McKee's body odor. We'll rock, buddy. We climbed the salt-crunchy steps and stood in snowy night by Marty's dented Camry. Freezing air blessed my burning face. Rob, hey, you're gonna be fine. He dug jingling keys from a pocket, poked one into the door. I got the faith, my brother. He pulled open the door and climbed in. Thanks to the Brushinskis, I said. He grinned, fired up the engine. No problem. Hey, you think about going out to Clem's for ribs sometime soon, eh? That'd be great. Later. Okay. And that was that. 6. Easy for me to say, I guess. And that was that. Now I was getting tempted in Marty's exit to start the OCD rhyming shit. A sure indicator of a troubling night, assuring me with casual ease how far away I remained from normal. This alone is an example of just how quickly you can slip from sane into the chattering gears of neuroses. Make no mistake, the passage is deceptively smooth and mercilessly definite. An hour ago, you were fearful, yet fine. Now, left alone, you feel insects creep across vibrating neuronic plates, plucking holds between old mania and new stability. Uninvited guests rifling your brain box cooler for final drinks and something to devour. You give in, and the motherfucker will own you. Sweetest memories become curses, plots designed to seduce, love, and tear apart your soul. Because you are so special, so vital. Even a stranger's smile is there to escalate your ruin when you know it. You know. 7. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. I think I just decided to quit sleeping. Forever. Awoke, thrashing for breath, damp with rank sweat and heart thumping out nightmare venom. Worse, for some reason I'd crashed fully clothed on the couch, not my usual method of approaching rest. Why was the clapped-out carpet marked with a wet spot? No fucking way. I rolled off the couch and sniffed the door. Good news. Only the haunting aroma of beer has passed. No piss or puke. Only water, peppered with dirt specks. Struggling to my feet, I padded over to the workstation where I'd left my camo chucks, dropped into the chair's chronic squeak, and pulled on my sopping shoes. What the hell? The canvas was thoroughly soaked, as though I'd bathed in my Converse or worn them outside, which I'd never do in winter. That's what Jesus made boots for. I pulled them off and did what the manufacturer advised for such traumatic situations. Stuffed my shoes with newspaper. This method I had found after a camping trip worked better than anything. Extracted moisture as if designed for that purpose. The news always sucked anyway. For the first time in my life, I craved a fresh, out-of-bed beer. Anything to obliterate the dreadful fucking images lingering in my mind. Dull my ringing ears. I'd have murdered for a couple of Valium. The more I turned it over, the less sure I felt. Had it been a nightmare? I'd found myself lost and cold and afraid, plodding through dense evergreens dusted with snow. An iron sky menaced the day with rushing dark clouds, and a profound sense of threat surged through me. No distant traffic could be heard, and I knew I must be deep within this alien forest. Which way to go? So far as I could tell, nothing existed but trees, sky, wind, and immense silence. A shriek, god-awful, tore the air, echoed for a few seconds. What the fuck? Was that a woman? Some animal? I sure as hell didn't want to ever hear it again, and it had sounded way too close. Was something coming for me? Another shriek? Jesus Christ. Something in pain. That was all too clear. My terror eased to low fright. Already lost, now I felt as if I might help someone, human or beast, from their own misery, and trotted over crisp pine needles toward what I thought was the general direction of the sound. Here, the pines gathered in crowded ranks, real beauties, at least 80 or 90 feet tall, and wide as houses. The snow, bright on their branches, confused me. It did the turpentine tang of resin in the air, more real than real, searing my eyes. Something snapped behind me. I turned. A rustling, chaotic with multiple snaps like twigs, came from behind one tree cloaked in white. This sounded like two or more animals struggling. I'd better be careful. Slowing to avoid crunchy footfalls, I hunched and edged around the fat evergreen. A naked woman with long black hair stood in the snow. My shocked breath blast alerted her, and she glared with fierce green eyes like stars. Blood spattered her breasts and ran down her form, vivid against the white flesh, the delta of her furred muff. Far, far worse than blood was its source. The woman gripped the neck of a plump white swan, one wing wrenched off and discarded. Its splintered nub bled and steamed at the snow. My heart raced so I could hear it. I backed away. She grinned, revealing perfect white teeth, stained red. The swan twitched, and she tore off its remaining wing with a wet crack. "Emily?" I managed. A blare from a horn the size of a city shattered the sky, and I woke. 8. Spent the day trying to exorcise the nightmare by cleaning the apartment, putting on a pot of chili, incorporating the Trinidad scorpion peppers Marty had given me a week ago, insanely hot, like flowery embers, and watching Vasyl Gorkowski's The Empty Place, a 1962 black and white film about a crazy painter obsessed with a mysterious woman he sees wherever he goes. It's the most incredibly eerie movie I've ever seen, and I hate watching it. But I can't stop. Probably watched it over 100 times, and I know it's every bleak gray sky, wind-haunted trees, cafe cellar, shadows. The brushstroke of the doomed artist, a dead ringer for Peter Murphy in his Bauhaus days. He never gets a clear view of the woman's face, so fills the vacuum with a series of anguished paintings, which become more disturbing the closer he gets to completion, actually encountering the woman, and cosmic insanity. The huge encyclopedia of Euro films on my paltry shelf tells me that Gorkowski, after a September 1963 arrest for assaulting a young woman in Tripoli, died of poisoning on November 22nd, 1963, date of the JFK assassination. He drank a tin of mineral spirits in the studio of abstract expressionist Ulrich Torson, aspirated and choked on his vomit, rumored to be composed of partially digested photos of the woman he'd assaulted. My big book also claims Gorkowski's home editing studio was found to be stacked with film cans labeled Juan. More than 700 hours of footage the director's long-suffering wife refused to release to authorities. I burned it all, every moment of empty, black obscenity, she said. 1 month later, she vanished and was never heard from again. Turns out, Wahn is a German word, meaning mania or delirium. There were no cans of mineral spirits available in my newly ordered place. At 7 p.m. precisely, my kitchen floor started vibrating. The tall glasses in my well-arranged cabinet rattled. 7 o'clock can be noted in numerals as 700. The hours of Gorkowski's unseen Wahn footage, forever lost because of a melancholic wife, herself assigned to oblivion. Shouldn't that count for something? I'm close to giving up and getting that job on Moody's sizzling grill. 9. Just back from seeing Herr Wagner. Pills. I'm a liar. Emily is a ghost. Lost hope of my life. I will pay attention now. I will obey. I will obey the black surge of time, the lies of my soul, the empty promise of Tuesdays and shadows at noon. I kneel before the altar of nothingness, the only reality. Emily never was real, you see. How could she be? It isn't allowed. Such fierce life is forbidden, met only in dreams of sad, corrosive souls, in minds seething with insanity and dread and futility. I will have my say. No one controls me. No one has the right, but I see now. I see. Marty is a phantom. A telephone number to nowhere and nothing. A friend in my anguished craving for friends, too good to exist. Wagner proved it, even with the police standing there in my private home. My private home. They could not hear Emily's luminous music, her taunting whisper, nor decipher the notes she wrote only from my eyes. Grocery store receipts. Nothing more. I was out of my mind. The professionals know this, but they haven't seen Emily dance through flurries of black snow, nor heard the droning approach of her sentinels in their terrible forms. Their slaughtering touch, the impossible code of their numbers. And no Marty in the phone book. They made me look. Oh, what happened? What did I love? Where is she? I'm the only one. The only. I would not give her back. But it was impossible to stop the green wave, the sweeping black hurt of her sweet voice. It was all I ever wanted. Just to matter. Just to be. To kiss the sweet mouth of the unknown come from me. I smelled her. I tasted her. Heard the forbidden diaries from a world beyond rationality and all that is bearable. In my room, when we were together during free time, she showed me the way. I held her sweet, soft hand. God damn it! Heard tales from another place, without war and death and uncertainty, where nothing ever changed, and colossal structures webbed with emotions plucked from worlds with seas and sons. Fuck them! Fuck them! I despaired. I shoved her back into it. At the end of that dark hall, Emily opened a door I had never seen. You deserve this, she said, and opened that door. Whether the black, spidery forms waiting, clothed in stars, were gods or not, I cannot say. But they wanted me, and I couldn't bear the sight of them. Is it because of my love? My obsession? That Wagner was found in a scatter of shredded dead meat. He who had murdered thousands because he couldn't find their souls. The ripper of essence. Fucking eater of the hearts of starving children. They took her back because I could not long bear her presence. A being beyond good and evil. Beyond the god-fuckers in their soulless search. My true love. Too real to exist. Welcome back, said Dr. Smythe, my tense watcher. A new room, but this one has cameras. They're looking for something. But what? A visit from Marty? Conspirators in Wagner's slaughter? I don't know. But I will always remember, especially when it rains, to stand at my caged window and watch for the luminous music. The black snow. To keep it together. Because there must be meaning to life. Am I right? Someday, I'll find it.
Dead Wax by Blake Earl Ray. A bead of sweat was tracing its way down Edward Midge's cheek behind the lank tendril of his long, greasy hair. Before he could wipe it away, it made its way down to his chin and dropped squarely on the cardboard cover of the vinyl record in his hands. "God damn, it's hot in here," Edward said to himself as he wiped up the drop with the heel of his hand. He looked up from the long wooden crate hand-labeled Punk and New Wave at the cashier standing behind the high counter. The cashier was frowning deeply at Edward. The store was small and dim. The lights were the kind of flickering fluorescent bulbs that obviously hadn't been changed in a long time. They buzzed at a frequency that was just barely audible. A large box fan propped open the front door, but it didn't seem to be helping much. The room was hot, and Edward moved his black-clad bulk around awkwardly between aisles, acutely aware that he was the only one in the store and that, even if he weren't, he would still stand out. The cashier gave Edward a perfunctory half-smile, then looked back down at his phone. He couldn't have been more than 25, easily Edward's junior by 10 years. Edward knew the type. Back when he had been picked up to play rhythm guitar by a thrash metal outfit out of Florida called Corpus Christi, skinny little guys like the cashier had been all the rage. They would get on stage in vintage cowboy shirts and their sisters' jeans and play what amounted to Trogs covers for a half hour and then sit at the bar, letting girls buy them drinks and ignoring the other bands. Edward had hated them. He still did, even though the label that had coaxed him out of his PhD program had folded 6 years before. Corpus Christi rebranded and kicked him out a couple of weeks later. Since then, Edward had applied to 4 different PhD programs. In the meantime, he had gotten himself a gig teaching Introduction to Writing at a community college. The cashier would ride his good looks and slim frame for as long as he could. Like you wouldn't, fat boy, Edward thought bitterly. Edward made his way toward the door. There wasn't anything in here he didn't already have and needed. As he was rounding the corner, though, something caught his eye. There was a black corner of a record sleeve sticking out between 2 of the crates. With idle curiosity, he picked it up. The sleeve was a faded matte black, like a shirt that had been through the wash too many times. Slashed across the black were off-white lines that made up a vaguely sinister geometric design. It wasn't quite a pentagram, but it was close. Printed in a crabbed script across the bottom were the words, De Vermis Mysterious. It would be easy to write the record off as some shock rock black metal copy, but there was something about how Edward felt holding it that wouldn't allow him to do that. He felt powerful. He felt connected with the world, like everything was finally in the same tempo, a quick staccato syncopation. Edward looked up at the counter. The cashier was gone. The birds and insects, and even the sounds of traffic outside, were all gone. The fluorescence still buzzed, and the fan hummed, but underneath it all there was a pregnant silence. There was a spectral, anticipatory quality in the air of the shop. It was a rural church on a Saturday afternoon. It was waiting to be filled with noise, music, people, and ritual. It was hungry for it. Edward shook his head, his long dark hair swishing gently. He set the record down. The sun filtering through the dust-caked, flyer-choked windows of the vinyl shop started to have the look of a golden late afternoon. 25 or 6 to 4, he thought. It was an old song, but the melody of it, the familiarity, comforted him. A cool, damp rag on a feverish forehead. Carefully, Edward set the black record down on the top of a bin marked Soundtracks, in the same lazy but somehow hurried writing as all the others. His eyes lingered on the thing, but he turned with some difficulty. Edward hurried and got out of the cramped, hot store and into the afternoon sun. He was a good 30 yards down the street and very near his beat-up, champagne-colored Toyota when he realized he was holding the record. He turned to return it, but thought better of it. It wasn't like there were any cameras or anything in there, and the skinny dude at the counter had almost surely not noticed. Edward crossed the last 20 or so yards of cracked concrete sidewalk to his car. A fat, red wasp crept across the windshield, staring up at Edward with its utterly otherworldly compound eyes, swiveling its head in an unnatural, robotic way. It cleaned its forelegs and then took unsteadily to the air. Edward spent most of his ride home irritably scanning through the radio for anything worthwhile. He was sorely disappointed. Everything seemed so banal and ordinary. Overplayed 90s hits gave way to uninspired pop, and it was all interspersed with the absolute nonsense that was drive-time radio banter. By the time he had surrendered and snapped off the radio in disgust and disappointment, Edward realized he was home and pulled into the parking lot in front of his building. It had been a long day, or at least as long as his days ever were. He had taught 3 freshman composition classes and graded papers in the sad, little communal office space reserved for adjuncts. It was a terrible room with the ceiling tiles bowing and sagging with age. The blinds were broken, and it was always dim in there. Some of his co-workers had taken to calling it the cave. Not to him, though. They rarely spoke to him. The thought of coming home to his cramped apartment had made his jaw clench up, so Edward had hit up the record store in an attempt to find something to listen to as he drank cheap beer on a gray couch that did not even come pre-assembled. Edward guessed he had at last found the record. De Vermis Mysterious was sitting on the cigarette-burned fabric of the passenger seat. Something about the way it laid there reminded Edward of a coiled snake. There was a lot of dangerous potential in it, wasn't there? The alien scratched design on the cover and the weird Latin-sounding name was like a warning. It was called aposematism in nature. It was like a coral snake whose stripes and bright colors let everyone know they were full of deadly venom. As he reached over and grabbed the record, Edward tried to shake the weird feeling of dread that was hanging over him. He was sweating again, even with his hair tied back in a messy ponytail. He sighed and lurched out of the sports sedan. At the top of the 3rd flight of stairs, Edward was breathing heavily. He could smell his body odor. He opened the door and walked directly to the fridge, kicking the front door closed with his heel. In the refrigerator, he rooted around until he found a cold Mexican lager. He crossed to the living room and took in his surroundings. It stank. It had since the day he moved in, despite his landlord's admonition that there was to be no smoking inside. The apartment was small and smelled like cigarettes and old cooking. There was a low scuffed coffee table with a dirty but empty ashtray across from the only couch. Propped against the sofa was his sunburst Takamine G series. It was in dire need of a restringing and setup. The only thing in the living room that didn't need replacing was his hi-fi system. It was a vintage model, about the size of a low sideboard table. The speakers were incredible, and the needle on the turntable had recently been replaced. Edward ran his hand across it lovingly. The wood was smooth and shiny. Edward put De Vermis Mysterious down and drew the vinyl out of the sleeve. The record itself was pretty average looking. It had a red label with the title printed in gold. Edward cracked the beer, took a slow, grateful sip, and set the record on the turntable. He turned up the volume and set the needle into the first groove. He turned the system on and shivered. Nothing happened besides a slight popping static. Edward frowned. The player had been working that morning. He had been listening to Sabbath Bloody Sabbath as he got ready for work. He flopped his 300-pound bulk down on the couch and drained his beer. His eyes shut, and the image of Claire flashed through his mind. She was wearing the mint green tank top she had been wearing in class on Monday. Her black hair, cropped right below her ears with Betty Page bangs, swirled as she laughed at what some stupid fucking jock kid sitting next to her said. Her heavy tits bounced a little. Edward was getting aroused. At some point, he fell asleep thinking about the girl. Edward opened his eyes. The hi-fi was playing. He crossed the room in an instant and stared at the record. It was De Vermis Mysterious, and it was running backward. The sound was something between 80s synth goth and 90s lo-fi black metal. It was incredible. He was aroused, more aroused than he had been in a long time. God damn, he was rigid. He heard someone talking from the kitchen. Edward turned as if deep underwater. There was pressure, resistance. As he turned, he saw the shimmering, distant mirage image of Claire standing on the precipice of a large cliff where his oven should have been.
"Take me,"
she whispered. Her voice sounded overly processed, like it had been recorded over and over on an analog device.
"Take me."
Claire was naked now, her breasts heaving and her body slick with sweat. Her stomach and thighs glistened orange and red in the light of a setting sun. She was in the middle of an orgasm, moaning and twisting in exaggerated ecstasy. The look on her face, however, didn't seem to match. Perhaps it was a panic attack. The excessive fear in her eyes made him wonder, but there was no way to tell. Edward was beside her. He touched her skin. It collapsed, rotten, like old fruit. Edward screamed. The sound was feedback, a guitar with heavy distortion pressed against a half-stack amp. Edward's eyes shot open. His hair was plastered to his neck in wet hanks. De Vermis Mysterious was turning on the record player, the needle scratching impotently against the dead wax between the label and the grooves. Edward stopped the turntable. He put the needle gently in the last groove and began running the record backward. The music from his dream came bubbling out of the speakers with an insidious intensity. The screeching guitars and guttural vocals in some unknown language sent a thrill through him. He noticed the hair on his arm was standing on end. The feeling pumping through him was turning into pain. He pulled his hand away from the black disc, but it kept spinning. Edward sat down cross-legged on the floor. He stared so hard at the hi-fi, or maybe his eyes were closed, that he didn't notice when he wet himself. The afternoon sun was lying thickly on the carpet when Edward came to. He stumbled up and made his way to the shower. He reeked of urine, and his mouth was sour with bile. He had already missed his classes. Dressed and cleaned up, Edward arrived on campus with just 30 minutes left of his office hours. He sat in the parking lot with the air conditioner blasting, staring across the glittering asphalt at the building that shimmered in the August heat. He had lost almost a whole day. Somewhere inside, he knew the thought should trouble him, but it didn't. It all felt really distant, inconstant and wavering, like the buildings through the heat. The second or third track, it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began, of De Vermis Mysterious played on a loop in his head. There was a guttural chant perched on Edward's lips. It didn't seem to come from the record, but he had not known it before. There were drums behind it, booming and echoing before men had known not to play certain rhythms. Edward knew with certainty that certain melodies, rhythms, time signatures, and words came from somewhere else. The scales were all wrong. There was a pulsing dissonance in between halftones that crept up the spinal cord and lodged themselves in the deep, dark animal brain, hidden beneath the centuries of domestication. When Claire exited the English building and began making her way through the parking lot, Edward's eyes focused again. He took a ragged breath. He tracked her between the cars. She was wearing jean shorts that hugged her hips tightly and a light blue spaghetti strap top. Edward wet his lips with his tongue and rolled down his window. "Miss Watson?" Edward called. Claire's head snapped around at the sound of her name. She walked toward the car, confused.
Dr. Mitch?
Edward winced. "Professor," he corrected. She had crossed to the car and was standing with her textbook, an asinine collection of example essays he had been required to assign, pressed protectively against her chest. Edward looked around. The parking lot was surprisingly, fortuitously, empty. Edward struggled up out of the driver's seat to stand in front of the slight young student. "Do it now," a voice in his head said. He wondered what it was exactly, feeling the knowledge just beyond his mental grasp.
Sorry.
Claire said with a quick glance around. If she noticed that the world around them had emptied out, she didn't recognize the danger.
Why were you not in class today? Are you sick?
"Now, Edward." The voice was more insistent. Something about it made Edward think of someone holding a heavy door open.
We all wrote our names down on this piece of paper for attendance. I have it here. I didn't really expect to, see you, I guess.
The girl fumbled around, pulling a piece of loose-leaf paper out of her book that was creased and folded meticulously. The heavy door in Edward's mind was closing. "That's very responsible of you," Edward said. The girl smiled, extending the paper to him. "Now!" the voice hissed in an urgent, demanding tone that made Edward's teeth hurt, like he had gulped freezing water. Edward smiled at Claire, only just then realizing he had been holding a hefty claw hammer. It was the black-handled one from his junk drawer he had inherited from his permanently disappointed father and had used to hang pictures and, one time, fix the bathroom cabinet. The weight of it was nice in his hand. "I love you," Edward said. It was true. He did. He felt terrible for what was about to happen. Claire's eyes went wide, and Edward couldn't be sure if she noticed the hammer or not. Either way, there was no time to waste. He brought the hammer down, hard, right between her eyes, which Edward saw for the first time had tiny flecks of hazel in with the green. They really were striking. Claire moaned and dropped to the concrete, the book flopping out of her limp arms. The paper sawed back and forth through the air toward the ground. As she collapsed, her head struck the ground hard enough to bounce. Her feet jumped and skittered on the pavement. Her mouth was moving, but she wasn't making words. There was a semicircular rip in her skin between her manicured eyebrows, just below her bangs. It was already bleeding badly. Edward brought the hammer down again, causing a loud pop underneath the dull thump as her pretty, wide eyes rolled back in her head. Her body was still. Edward scooped her up in his arms, easily managing her weight. He opened the back driver's side door and tossed the girl inside before slamming the door and inspecting the hammer. There was blood and skin stuck to the head. Edward licked it clean as he climbed in and started the car. The door in his mind shut, and around him Life seemed to have restarted, none the wiser. Edward pulled out of the parking lot and snapped on the radio. Static hissed at him like a cornered animal. In the back seat, Claire moaned. Her eyelids fluttered, but remained closed. Good, Edward thought. She's not dead yet. By the time he had gotten back to his apartment, Edward had given up on the radio. He was riding with the AC up and the windows down, humming a tune from his dream. As he pulled into his usual space, he noticed no one about, and the blinds on every window he could see were down and closed. Everything was going his way today. It was a cheery thought, and he grinned. Edward bounded up the metal and concrete stairs to his apartment, effortlessly buoyed by a boyish excitement he hadn't felt in years. He threw the door wide and carried Claire across the threshold in his arms, a groom and bride on their wedding night. Edward laid Claire on the couch and turned on the record player. It was running forward again. He sat down across from the prone form of the girl. De Vermis Mysterious began playing. Edward was shaking with excitement. Claire opened her eyes and screamed. Edward clamped a hand over her mouth. He needed her to be quiet. How was she supposed to hear the music if she wouldn't be quiet? By the time the record was finished and ready to be flipped, Claire was dead. Edward had strangled her as the hi-fi system drowned out her feeble pleas and promises. There was blood on his arms and face from her nails. They were both drenched in sweat. Just a little lover's spat, he thought, laughing under his breath. Edward stared down at the corpse. Claire was a thing now. A dirty, bloody thing that had scratched at him and screamed and very nearly ruined his listening experience. He reached down and touched the skin just below her chin, delicately this time. The flesh there was puffy and blackened from his thumbs. What a poor little thing. Why couldn't she have just been quiet? Edward flipped the record and stood over the prone form of the girl. He stroked her stomach, flat but soft and beginning to cool. Her skin was smooth as he bent and pressed his lips to hers. There was no movement. He knew there wouldn't be, but he had held out hope that somehow the record could give him that too. He kissed her again, but felt nothing. Disgusted, he rolled the body off the couch and took its place. He fell asleep listening to the scratch on the needle, heading for the blood-red label. Edward woke up in the bedroom. It wasn't his bedroom, or at least he didn't think it was. It must have been, though. There was a picture of his parents on the nightstand, and his degrees framed on the wall. But the room was much bigger than his apartment, and cleaner. The furniture wasn't new, per se, but it wasn't the hand-me-downs that had previously populated his place. The wood of the short nightstand and the long, low dresser was dark, almost black. The smell of someone making coffee and frying bacon drifted in through the open bedroom door. Edward swung his feet out of bed, feeling the carpet between his toes. The carpet was thick and cream-colored, like in a real house. It wasn't the stained industrial stuff he was used to in every apartment he had ever rented. Edward stood and stretched. He groaned.
Baby?
Came a woman's voice from somewhere across the house. It bounced around Edward's mind, struggling to connect to clear memory. Claire? But it couldn't be. She was dead. He knew that. Or was it all some sort of dream? Edward walked out of the bedroom and down a short hallway he similarly didn't recognize. There were paintings on the walls, abstract color studies. They weren't bad, but they weren't by an especially trained hand either. Did Claire paint? He didn't know. They had rarely talked about anything other than her grade or the lecture of the day. Did she do that first essay on Picasso? Maybe she did. Or perhaps that was the blonde girl who sat in the back. Claire came into view in the kitchen doorway, wearing his faded Melvin's shirt and a pair of pink bikini underwear that just barely peeked out from beyond the bottom hem of the shirt as she stretched up to open the spice cabinet. Edward froze in the doorway. The day before came rushing back to him. The hollow, wet thump of the hammer. The feel of the strained tendons of Claire's neck under his fingers. And the sound of the record playing as she gasped and gurgled and begged. She had begged.
I'll do anything!
She had cried. Anything but be quiet. Sorry, no extra credit this time, he thought, laughing silently.
Good morning, Sleeping Beauty,
Claire said as she turned and saw him. She smiled. It was a truly stunning expression. Edward smiled and sat down at the table. Claire came over with 2 plates piled high with scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, and a potato and onion hash. Edward ate heartily, smiling dumbly at Claire between bites. She smiled back. They didn't talk. It was rude to speak with a full mouth. She truly was a great cook. There was a flair to the food and precision that spoke of someone who took great pride in any form of expression. Edward loved her for it. As the food dwindled, Edward noticed that the silence in the room was almost complete. He couldn't hear the roaring, ocean-like surge of the interstate like he could at what he was now thinking of as the old place. Claire's fork scraped her plate, and Edward winced. He could hear her chewing, and it set his teeth on edge. He swallowed hard. "Honey," he said, trying out the pet name for size. Claire didn't react, so he knew he called her that often here in this home. Did she live here? She certainly seemed to know where everything was. "Do you think we could put on some music? It's a little quiet in here."
Of course, baby,
Claire replied with her big, shining smile. She hopped up and crossed the room, her hips swaying gently from side to side in a way that Edward had always appreciated as she left his stupid little class. The girl crossed to the hi-fi system, seemingly the only thing left over from the old apartment. She picked up the familiar faded record sleeve, De Vermis Mysterious. Only it didn't look so faded. The cardboard was glossy and new-looking. "Not that one," Edward said quickly.
I bet you love this one.
Edward cocked his head. Maybe they listen to it all the time. "You're right, honey. I guess I do." There was a moment of pregnant silence before the first note. The first blast of feedback and distortion came pouring through the speakers, filling the room like smoke. He grabbed the long-bladed knife that Claire had used to cut the vegetables. Edward reveled in it, breathed it in, and swallowed it. He hid it down by his side and crossed the room to stand behind the girl and smell her hair. It was lightly floral. There was a hint of husky vanilla coming from the nape of her neck. He leaned in, brushing her cheek with his lips as he thrust the blade in between the second and third ribs in her chest. Claire screamed and pushed away from the knife, which only drove her deeper into Edward's arms. He wrapped her up tightly, feeling the squirm of her surprisingly muscular body against him. She really was sexy. In a flash, he struck 3 more times. The initial resistance, followed by a sudden give, made his stomach feel like he was falling. Claire began to gurgle and sputter as blood filled her lungs. 2 more strikes and it was over. He lay down on the big couch and listened to the record, drowsy and satisfied. The body crumpled in front of the record player didn't move. "I love you, honey." Edward rolled to face the plush back of the couch. There were days, whole weeks even, when he didn't kill her. He would live the life the record had given him, eating, drinking, and making love to Claire. Often they were married. Usually, although not always, they had met in class. Most of the time, he was fully tenured and lectured on music at the university. Claire called him Doc in those lives. Always, though, his inevitable bad luck would creep back in. He would show up to work drunk or try to seduce another student and get himself fired. If things went on too long at home, the tedium of everyday life would creep in. He and Claire would argue. He would forget chores. He would have to reset. One morning, after a night spent beating Claire to death with a heavy lamp, he woke up sore. It wasn't entirely unusual. He had often woken up with the little scrapes and bruises from the day or night before still lingering into the new world. Claire wasn't in bed. That was fine. The one thing that seemed most consistent was that the girl was an early riser. He padded from a king-sized bed in what looked to be a professionally decorated room into the master bathroom. It was all white tile and shining brass fixtures. "You've got a lot of scratch this time. It wouldn't be too bad to hang out here for a while." Edward stood over the toilet, popped his spine with his hands pressed to the small of his back, and took a piss. Passing a mirror, he noticed that his hair and beard were much more coiffed and trimmed than usual, professionally styled in a precise way. His gut, which was always big, looked smaller. Edward patted it appreciatively. Perhaps he had found a life he wouldn't want to trade. Edward found his way into the living room. It was breathtaking. The room was decked out in black and white furniture and accents that looked expensive in the modernist, subtle way that truly quality pieces often do. Professional oil paintings were hanging up on the walls. They had Claire's flair for color and bold brushstrokes. The paintings were much more studied and experienced, though. Time to perfect it, Edward thought. We must be so happy here. "Honey?" he called, looking around the room. There was no answer. His eyes swept the room, settling on the only thing out of place, Edward's old hi-fi system. Claire was sitting in front of it, with a large pair of headphones on and a record sleeve loosely tucked into her left hand. She was heavily pregnant, but wore it with a glowing grace that Edward found awe-inspiring and erotic at the same time. She smiled widely at Edward and let the record sleeve drop to the floor. It was De Vermis Mysterious, a tattered old copy. His copy, Edward noted, had not looked like that in a long time. Edward's blood ran cold. There was no way of telling how long she had been listening. God damn it. Maybe he could escape. He didn't know the house. There was no apparent front door. She knew the house, though. She always did. She stared at him, her eyes flashing. The lives, the worlds, the murders. They were all right there in the depths of her knowing eyes. And they were deep. So deep they felt like the crushing depths of a dark ocean trench. There was no light there, and no air. Sweat made its way down the back of his neck. He swatted at it. Claire, for her part, sat coiled, a venomous beauty about her.
Good morning, sleeping beauty.
Claire said as she raised her right hand, leveling the revolver at his face. Honey, please, Edward pleaded, holding his palms up to her. Could he talk her out of it? She ever talk you out of it, fat boy? Where would he go? Would she wake up next to him in the kitchen making breakfast? Of course not, said a chuckling voice in Edward's head. There were only so many grooves in a record he knew. He looked across at the turntable as the needle finished off the first side. It scratched, skipping into the dead wax. Claire had not moved the revolver or taken off the headphones. The hair on her arm was standing on end. The last thing that passed through Edward's mind was how the morning sunlight made Claire's green and hazel-flecked eyes so goddamn pretty. They were so sharp and pretty, it hurt. Claire pulled the trigger. Edward wasn't even alive long enough to hear the report. A mist of blood and brain splattered against a canvas covered in bold swipes of yellows. The body fell back against the wall in a broken, useless heap. Claire stood, turned the record over, placed the needle into the first groove, and turned up the volume. She sat back down on the plush carpet, crossing her long legs and leaning back against the side of the record player. She sighed and rubbed her stomach, full of life and hope. She closed her eyes and dreamed of a better world.
Chilling tales for dark nights.